Lori. The Crimes and Convictions of Lori Vallow Daybell. Updated through the 2025 Arizona sentencing and 2026 appeal proceedings. Written by Alana Sanchez. Copyright 2026 Alana Sanchez. All rights reserved. No part of this book may be reproduced in any form or by any electronic or mechanical means, including information storage and retrieval systems, without written permission from the author, except for the use of brief quotations in a book review. A note on this account. This book reconstructs the case of Lori Vallow Daybell from the public record. Indictments, charging affidavits, sworn trial testimony, closing arguments, autopsy and coroner findings entered into evidence, law enforcement statements, and the contemporaneous reporting of national and regional newsrooms. Where a claim was contested in court, or rests on a single witness, the text identifies it as such. Where two sources disagreed on a date or a detail, the more authoritative or better corroborated version was used, and the uncertainty noted. Quotations are drawn from sworn testimony, recorded statements played in open court, and reporting on public proceedings. Nothing in these pages is invented. Where the record is silent, this account stays silent too. Author disclosure. The author should also disclose a personal connection to the religious context discussed in this book. I was born into and baptized at the age of 8 years old, in the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. I have not attended church for many decades, and I no longer believe in, associate with, or practice its principles. I disclose this background because this case involves religious language, doctrine, and fringe beliefs connected to, but not endorsed by, the mainstream LDS Church. My personal history gives me familiarity with the culture and vocabulary surrounding those beliefs, but it is not the basis for the factual account that follows. This book relies on public records, court proceedings, sworn testimony, official statements, and contemporaneous reporting. I also want to be clear about the distinction between mainstream Latter-day Saint belief and the private doctrine Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell came to espouse. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints does believe in prophecy, revelation, visions, healing, tongues, interpretation of tongues, and other spiritual gifts. Those gifts are named in its articles of faith. From my own background in the church, I can say that belief in spiritual gifts is not itself unusual within Latter-day Saint teaching. But the ideas at the center of this case, zombies, castings, death percentages, displaced spirits, multiple mortal probations, and the belief that killing a body could release a spirit, aren't teachings I recognize as part of the mainstream doctrine I was raised with. They belong to the fringe religious world around Lori and Chad, not to ordinary Latter-day Saint belief as it is taught in church. This book is not an argument for or against the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. It is an account of crimes committed by individuals whose beliefs, prosecutors argued, were used to justify harm. Nothing in the strangeness of those beliefs, the zombies, the castings, the past lives on other planets, should be allowed to eclipse the human fact at the center of the case. 5 people sit at the center of the story as the principal victims and intended victim. Charles Vallow, shot dead in his estranged wife's hallway. Tylee Ryan, 16, and Joshua J.J. Vallow, 7, her children, found in the ground behind a doomsday author's house. Tammy Daybell, that author's wife of nearly 30 years, suffocated in her own bed. And Brandon Boudreau, the intended victim who survived. 2 of the victims who died were children. The pages that follow try to hold 2 truths at once: that the ideology was bizarre, and that the harm was deliberate, calculated, and permanent. Lori Vallow Daybell has been convicted by multiple juries, in 2 states, of crimes connected to these deaths and the attempted killing of Brandon Boudreau. She maintains her innocence and, as of 2026, has appeals pending. Those appeals, and exactly what they argue, are set out in full near the end of the book. The reader is asked to keep an open mind about the legal questions those appeals raise while keeping a clear eye on what is no longer in dispute. That these deaths happened, that they were no accident, and that the people responsible built a theology to make the unforgivable feel, to themselves, like mercy. Chapter 1. California Roots. It was just a big family, and we did have a lot of fun. Janice Cox. Lori Noreen Cox was born on June 26, 1973, in the Loma Linda and San Bernardino area of Southern California, into a large, devout family of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. She was near the youngest of her siblings, and she grew up in a household where faith was not one element of life among many, but the frame around all of it. Her mother, Janice Lee Cox, would later describe a home full of scripture and noise and warmth, a house where the children loved the Book of Mormon, and where, she said, Lori always loved the scriptures and took to it right away. Her father, Barry Lynn Cox, was the spiritual center of that home, and Lori adored him. She once called him a spiritual giant. And the phrase is worth pausing on, because it reveals something about how she would come to understand the world. From the beginning, Lori associated holiness with a single charismatic man who possessed, or claimed to possess, special access to divine truth. A man whose certainty was its own form of authority. That template, harmless enough in a daughter's love for her father, would later be transferred onto a very different man, with catastrophic results. The Cox household was not, however, an ordinary church-going family. Barry and Janice identified with the ideology of the so-called sovereign citizen movement and styled themselves tax protesters. For the better part of 2 decades they were in conflict with the Internal Revenue Service, filing and losing a long series of challenges and refusing, as a matter of principle, to accept that they were subject to federal taxation. Barry pleaded guilty at one point to making a false statement to the IRS, and to shield assets from the federal government, he placed property in the name of one of his sons. A detail that would echo strangely years later, given which son's name kept appearing in the family's legal entanglements. The government would eventually sue Barry and Janice over hundreds of thousands of dollars in claimed back taxes. As late as November 2019, the very month the children's case was breaking open, Barry self-published an anti-government tract on how ordinary Americans might, in his telling, dismantle the IRS. This was the emotional weather of Lori's childhood. A family that saw itself as righteous and besieged, that regarded the institutions of the wider world with suspicion, and that treated its own convictions as standing above the law. It was a worldview in which the rules that bound everyone else did not quite bind the truly faithful. A child raised inside that logic learns, without anyone saying it aloud, that being chosen can place you beyond ordinary accountability. Lori learned it well. The Cox children were a tight, complicated brood. Accounts of the family differ on the exact count. Most public summaries name 4 siblings: Adam, Alex, Lori, and Summer. But there was an older sister, Stacy, who is frequently left out of the retellings. Stacy's life ended in tragedy of its own. By some family accounts, she was found near death in Hawaii while her brother Alex was using her credit cards. She mattered to the later story for one crucial reason. She was the mother of Melanie, who would become Melanie Boudreau, then Melanie Pulowski. The niece whose devotion to her Aunt Lori would pull her, and the man she had married, deep into the orbit of the crimes. Then there were the brothers. Adam Cox would, in time, become one of the most damning witnesses against his own sister. But it was Alex who would matter most, and most terribly. Alex Cox cast himself early as Lori's protector, the brother who would step between her and any threat. He was not, by the family's own later testimony, an entirely well man. Lori's sister Summer Shiflett would tell a jury that Alex had suffered brain damage in a car accident, and that his decision-making was, in her words, stuck at a teenage level. He was suggestible, loyal, and, as the world would learn, capable of being convinced of almost anything by the people he loved. In the hands of his sister, and the man she fell for, that pliability would be turned into a weapon. By her teenage years, Lori had grown into the kind of young woman a small community notices. Pretty, sociable, quick to laugh, a high school cheerleader, conspicuously devout. She graduated in the Rialto area of San Bernardino County in 1991. Those who knew her then describe a charming, magnetic girl who seemed to glow with faith and self-assurance, the sort of person who drew others towards her without obvious effort. There was nothing in that bright, sunny surface to suggest what lay ahead, and the gap between the cheerleader and the woman the tabloids would later christen the Doomsday Mom is part of what has made the case so disorienting for the public. People want a monster to look like one from the start. Lori never did. What the surface concealed was a set of traits that, recombined under the right pressure, would prove lethal: a hunger for spiritual significance, a comfort with the idea that ordinary rules need not apply to the chosen, an attraction to certain, dominant men who promised hidden truths, and a remarkable capacity to make other people believe her. None of these is a crime. All of them would later be load-bearing. The cheerleader from Rialto carried the seeds of the woman in the orange jumpsuit, and the distance between them is measured not in character, but in choices, a long chain of them, each one narrowing the next, until there was nowhere left to turn but towards the unthinkable. Chapter 2: The Serial Bride. Lori married young, and married often. Over roughly a decade and a half she would marry 5 times, and the arc of those marriages traces her slow drift from an ordinary, if turbulent, suburban life towards something far darker. Each husband entered believing he had found a warm, devoted, beautiful woman. Each, in his own way, would learn how quickly that warmth could turn to ice. Her first marriage came in 1992, when she was 19, to her high school boyfriend, Nelson Yanes. It ended in divorce almost as quickly as it began, a brief young union of the kind many people have and few remember. In October 1995, she married her second husband, William Legioia. Their son, Colby, was born the following year in 1996. That marriage, too, dissolved. Legioia filed, and they separated in 1998. Through these years, Lori trained and worked as a hairdresser, a beautician by trade, and she clearly enjoyed being looked at. In 2004, she stepped briefly onto larger stages, competing in the Mrs. Texas pageant and appearing as a contestant on the television game show Wheel of Fortune. She was made for an audience, poised, pretty, quick with a smile. The camera liked her, and she liked it back. In 2001, she married her third husband, Joseph Anthony Ryan Jr., who gave his surname to young Colby. The couple's daughter, Tylee Ashlyn Ryan, was born on September 24, 2002. By 2005, that marriage had collapsed, and what followed was not a clean parting but a scorched earth custody war that would stretch on for years and would, in retrospect, contain the first clear glimpse of how far Lori's family was willing to go on her behalf. During the custody fight, Lori accused Joseph Ryan of sexually abusing both children, allegations that shaped the proceedings and that Ryan denied. He eventually lost equal custody. Years later, Colby, as an adult, would say publicly that he had in fact been abused by Ryan as a child. The truth of what happened inside that marriage remains contested and painful, and is not the purpose of this book to resolve. What is documented is that in 2007 the conflict turned violent. Lori's brother Alex Cox attacked Joseph Ryan with a stun gun, later explaining that he had done it because Ryan had been abusive towards Lori and the children. Alex served 90 days in jail for the assault. That episode is the hinge of the chapter, because it established, more than a decade before the murders, the precise mechanism that would later kill people. Alex Cox would commit violence on his sister's behalf, and he would frame that violence to himself and to the world as protection, as righteousness. He was the loaded instrument. Lori was learning, even then, that she had one. Joseph Ryan died in 2018, found alone in his apartment. The medical determination was arteriosclerotic cardiovascular disease, heart disease. Years afterward, once Lori had been arrested and a recording had surfaced in which she spoke of having wanted Ryan dead, invoking, chillingly, the scriptural story of Nephi being commanded by God to kill a wicked man. Investigators went back and reviewed his death. They found nothing to support foul play, and Ryan's death stands officially as natural. But the recording is hard to forget, because in it Lori reached for the exact religious frame she would soon turn on the living. The vocabulary of holy killing was already in her mouth. By her early 30s, then, Lori had been married 3 times, had borne a son and a daughter, and had a brother who had gone to jail rather than let a perceived enemy go unpunished. She was charismatic, restless, financially unsettled, and increasingly preoccupied with religion. And she was still searching for a man who could be, in the phrase she would later use again and again, her spiritual equal, and for a purpose grander than the life she was actually living. Into that search walked a soft-spoken, generous financial planner from Texas. His name was Charles Vallow, and marrying Lori would cost him his life. Chapter 3. Charles Vallow. Leland Charles Anthony Vallow, Charles to everyone who knew him, was, by the accounts of the people who loved him, a generous and uncomplicated man. He had been a gifted college athlete, a baseball pitcher who made an immediate impression, a member of the Kappa Sigma fraternity, and briefly a semi-professional ballplayer before settling into a steady, respectable career in financial services. He had 2 sons from an earlier marriage, and a brother, Jerry, who would one day stand in an Arizona courtroom and speak for him because Charles could not speak for himself. People described Charles as a soft touch and a provider, the kind of man who made sure the people around him were taken care of, sometimes to his own detriment. Charles married Lori on February 24, 2006, in Las Vegas. For her, the marriage offered stability, comfort, and a man willing to remake himself in her image. Charles agreed to be baptized into the Latter-day Saint faith and built a life organized around hers. They had money, mobility, and, for a long stretch, the outward shape of a happy family. Around 2014, they moved to Kauai, Hawaii, where business records indicate they ran a small operation on the island. In 2017, they returned to Arizona, settling in the suburbs east of Phoenix. Lori's daughter, Tylee, lived with them. Colby, the eldest, was growing towards adulthood. And in 2013, Charles and Lori had taken in the child whose short life would become the unbearable center of the case. His name was Joshua Jackson Vallow, JJ. He was Charles's grandnephew, born on May 25, 2012, to birth parents who, because of substance use, could not care for him. JJ came into the world with drugs in his system and spent his first days in a neonatal intensive care unit. For nearly his first year, he was cared for by Charles's sister, Kay Woodcock, and her husband, Larry, who loved the boy fiercely. When Charles and Lori adopted JJ, it was on the express condition that the Woodcocks remain a permanent part of his life. And they did, moving to be near him, calling and visiting, refusing to let distance loosen the bond. JJ was later diagnosed with autism. He was, by every account from the people who knew him, an exuberant, particular, deeply loved little boy, and his teenage half-sister Tylee adored him, mothering him, treating him as her own. For a time the household held Charles and Lori, teenage Tylee, small JJ, with Colby grown and out on his own. From the outside it looked like an enviable second-act family. But somewhere around 2015, something in Lori began to change, and the people closest to her began to notice. It began, as nearly as anyone can date it, with books. Lori became absorbed in a series of religious novels titled Standing in Holy Places, written by a self-published Idaho author named Chad Daybell. The books fused Latter-day Saint imagery with apocalyptic prophecy. Visions of earthquakes, war, plague, and destruction sweeping the Americas before the Second Coming, and of a faithful remnant called to prepare. Lori read more and more widely in the same vein. First-hand accounts of near-death experiences, podcasts hosted by people who had left or been excommunicated from the mainstream church, fringe teachers who promised that the end was near and that a chosen few would be summoned to ready the world for Christ's return. What had been ordinary devotion curdled, over a few years, into something stranger and more grandiose. Friends and family later testified that it was around this time, roughly 2015, the same period she discovered Chad Daybell's writing, that the first genuinely alarming remarks surfaced. Lori had begun, even then, to speak about her own teenage daughter Tylee in unsettling terms, as though something dark had taken hold of the girl. At the time it sounded like a mother's strange turn of phrase, the kind of thing one lets pass. It was, in fact, the earliest visible fracture in the foundation, and it pointed directly at the doctrine that prosecutors later argued was used to rationalize Tylee's death. As Lori drifted, her marriage to Charles frayed and then tore. She confided to friends that Charles was not her spiritual equal, that she had outgrown him, that he could not follow where she was going. By early 2019 the situation had become frightening. In February 2019 Charles filed for divorce, and in the filings and in complaints to police, he set down fears that now read like prophecy. He said Lori had become infatuated with near-death experiences, that she claimed to have lived numerous past lives on other planets, that she believed she was a translated being or a god, sent to help carry out the work of the 144,000 at Christ's second coming, which she expected in July 2020, that she no longer wanted anything to do with her family because she had, as she put it, a more important mission. He said she had threatened to ruin him financially and to kill him. He obtained an order of protection. His attorney later stated plainly that Charles had expressed genuine fear for his life. He asked the court to order a mental health evaluation of his wife. He was not paranoid. He was early. Charles Vallow saw, more clearly and sooner than anyone, exactly what his wife had become and exactly what she was capable of, and he wrote it down, and he begged the system to act, and the system did not move fast enough. 5 months after he filed for divorce, on a July morning, he would be dead on the floor of her home, and Lori would try to claim the $1 million life insurance policy she believed would benefit her. Chapter 4. The Doomsday Prophet. Chad Guy Daybell was born on August 11, 1968, in Provo, Utah, and grew up in the neighboring town of Springville, in a Latter-day Saint family. There was nothing in his early life to forecast infamy, which is part of what makes the later facts so disorienting. He was quiet, bookish, unathletic, the kind of young man who disappears into the middle of a yearbook page. He earned a degree in journalism from Brigham Young University and worked for a time as a copy editor at the Ogden Standard-Examiner in northern Utah. To support himself during and after his studies, he took the work that would later supply the case with its grimmest irony. He dug graves, and then became the sexton, the caretaker, of the Springville Cemetery. The man who would one day bury 2 children in his own backyard had spent his early adulthood tending the dead for a living. In 1990, he married Tammy Douglas in Manti, Utah. Tammy was steady, intelligent, and grounded, a school librarian, the kind of person who anchors a family. Together they raised 5 children, and by every account, she was the reliable center of their home. They settled in Springville, and in 2004 the couple founded a small religious press, Spring Creek Book Company, through which Chad began to publish his own apocalyptic novels and similar work by other authors. Chad's ambition was never really journalism or grave tending. It was prophecy. He believed, or came to believe, or found it useful to claim he believed, that he had died and returned during 2 separate near-death experiences, and that these episodes had opened to him a channel of visions from beyond the veil. He set this claim down in a memoir, Living on the Edge of Heaven, and he insisted, with a straightness that unsettled even sympathetic readers, that his novels were not fiction at all, but accurate depictions of events still to come. His small press struggled at first, then found a durable readership among Latter-day Saint preppers. Believers convinced the second coming was imminent and that survival, spiritual and physical, required preparation. He became a fixture in certain radical, Mormon-adjacent circles, a guest on podcasts, a contributor to apocalyptically themed online forums, a speaker who could fill a room with people hungry to be told that the end was near and that they, specifically, had been chosen to endure it. His teachings hardened over time. In 2013, he began prophesying coming cataclysms in the Americas, earthquakes, war, mass death. In 2015, he said, a voice instructed him to move his family from Utah to eastern Idaho, in part because he had foreseen that Utah would be destroyed by an earthquake. He and Tammy relocated that June to Salem, a small town just outside Rexburg, an overwhelmingly Latter-day Saint city. Central to his private theology was a doctrine the mainstream church flatly rejects: reincarnation. He told his followers he had lived 31 previous lives on different worlds, and he taught the idea that would, in the end, license murder, that a living human being could become something other than themselves, that a body could be emptied of its true spirit and occupied by darkness, and that a man with the right gift could tell the difference. Chapter 5. Preparing a People. In October 2018, Lori Vallow attended a religious conference associated with a Latter-day Saint, adjacent media ministry called Preparing a People, in the company of 2 women she had recently befriended, Melanie Gibb and Zulema Pastines. There she met Chad Daybell in person for the first time. Both Gibb and Pastines would later testify that Lori was openly, conspicuously flirtatious with the married author. Chad, for his part, deployed the line he seems to have reserved for the women he wanted. He told Lori that the 2 of them had been married to each other across multiple previous lifetimes, that their connection was eternal and foreordained. To a woman who already believed she was a goddess with a cosmic mission, it was the most seductive thing a man could say. They began communicating privately, almost immediately. When Charles left town on a business trip, Lori hosted a small overnight gathering at her home. Chad attended, along with Gibb, and held the room, expounding his idiosyncratic doctrine of past lives, coming destruction, and chosen souls. Lori was rapt. Within weeks the 2 were lovers, and Lori had become not merely Chad's follower, but his co-prophet, a woman convinced that she stood at the very center of the approaching apocalypse. On December 5, 2018, the pair appeared together on a Preparing a People podcast episode pointedly titled Time to Warrior Up. They would feature in several more. It should be said, in fairness, that the Preparing a People ministry later stated it was not a cult, not a group one joins, but a producer of lecture events, and that it did not share any beliefs of Chad's or Lori's that ran contrary to Christian principles of honesty and truth. A tighter, stranger circle formed around Chad's actual teachings, which he and Lori told their intimates belonged to something they called the Church of the Firstborn, with Chad as its leader and prophet. The inner ring included Lori's niece Melanie, her friends Gibb and Pastines, and her brother Alex Cox, who would soon marry Pastines. Lori and Gibb even co-hosted their own podcast, Feel the Fire. On the surface, it was a community of fervent believers. Underneath, prosecutors would later argue, it was being quietly retooled into the machinery of a killing. Alex Cox's role inside that circle deserves particular attention, because it explains how an apparently ordinary family produced a man willing to shoot his brother-in-law and dig graves for children. Pastines, Alex's own wife, testified that Alex came entirely under the influence of Chad and Lori, who convinced him that he was a reincarnated warrior of God, that he had lived before as a great defender of the faithful, and that the only reason he had come to this life at this moment was to protect Lori and carry out the work of the last days. To a suggestible man whose judgment, by his sister's account, was stuck at a teenage level, this was intoxicating. He was not merely Lori's brother anymore. He was, in the story they told him, a hero with a holy commission. Prosecutors would later say flatly that Lori had groomed and manipulated Alex into becoming her instrument. The blessing Chad would one day pronounce over him, calling him a prophet and a hero who had helped in ways that can never be repaid, was the capstone of years of careful flattery. Chapter 6: Castings and Zombies. Their spouses, Lori's own children, and anyone who opposed them were labeled sometimes as dark spirits or even zombies. Prosecutors opening Chad Daybell trial. To understand everything that follows, one has to understand a belief system, because prosecutors described it, and juries in Lori's and Chad's cases accepted it, as a belief system used to rationalize murder. A theology engineered, whether cynically or sincerely, to dissolve the guilt of killing the people who stood in the way. The architecture was Chad's, refined over years of writing and lecturing, and Lori absorbed it whole. At its base was a simple, total sorting of humanity along a spectrum from light to dark. Light people were true followers of Jesus Christ, aligned with the work of the last days. Dark people had fallen under the influence of Satan. People could be rated, assigned a place on the scale. The group spoke of individuals as being a certain level of light or a certain level of dark. When Lori organized a so-called casting against Brandon Boudreaux, she told her niece Melanie that Boudreaux had been part of Hitler's group and was a very high dark. The vocabulary sounds absurd written down. Prosecutors argued that it was used in deadly earnest to identify who would be targeted. Above mere darkness sat a more extreme category. Chad taught that some people had crossed a threshold. Their original spirit had departed or been driven out, and a dark spirit, or simple emptiness, had moved into the body, leaving behind an animated shell that merely looked like the person it had been. The group's word for such a being was blunt and dehumanizing: a zombie. Once a loved one had been recategorized as a zombie, they were, in the logic of the doctrine, already gone. What walked around in their shape was an imposter, an obstacle, a thing. According to testimony, killing the body was reframed not as murder, but as release, a way of freeing the trapped or displaced spirit, and, in some tellings, even of doing the victim a kindness. Zulema Pastines testified that Chad told his followers JJ would die soon, only to come back later as Colby's son. A piece of doctrine so monstrous in hindsight that it is difficult to read as anything but a rationalization manufactured in advance of a planned killing. Daybell presented himself as uniquely able to read these hidden states. He claimed he could discern whether a person had gone dark or become a zombie, and he assigned people a death percentage, a reading of how close they were to death, which could rise or fall. Prosecutors later distilled the grim, repeatable pattern from the evidence. A target would be labeled dark by Chad. Their death percentage would be discussed and would drop. And then, the teaching held, the body had to die so the spirit could move on. Lori, for her part, claimed her own spiritual powers, the ability to cast out Satan and evil spirits. The castings were group rituals, prayers, and ceremonies aimed at the people who had been marked. On the very night Tammy Daybell was attacked in her driveway in October 2019, Pastines testified, she had been with Lori and Melanie performing a casting. The ritual and the rifle were two ends of the same act. The doctrine also came with a hard edge for anyone inside the circle who began to doubt it. Audrey Barachero, another former friend who had participated in the group, testified that when she grew uneasy and tried to dissolve the friendship, Lori threatened to murder her and dispose of her body in trash bags. This was not a community one could simply drift away from. To know what they believed and what they were doing in its name was to become a potential liability, and Lori had already shown, with Charles, with Tammy, with the children, what she did about liabilities. Lori took all of it into herself and made it grander. She came to believe she was a special, exalted being, by various accounts a goddess, a translated immortal, a leader of the 144,000 prophesied to gather at Christ's return, which she expected in the summer of 2020. The people obstructing her union with Chad and her cosmic role were, in her mind, no longer fully people. Her husband, her romantic rival, her teenage daughter, her 7-year-old son with autism. One by one, the family she had vowed to protect was reclassified in her own thinking as dark, as zombie, as disposable. And running alongside the cosmic motive was an older, baser one, which investigators and family members refused to let anyone forget. Charles carried a life insurance policy worth roughly $1 million. Prosecutors argued Lori expected to benefit from it, though Charles had changed the beneficiary before his death. The children generated Social Security survivor benefits, which Lori would move to collect after they were dead. Tammy stood between Chad and his remarriage, and her death paid out hundreds of thousands of dollars. There was even a curious financial undertow on Alex's side of the family. In August 2019, he took out a roughly $21,000 loan, ostensibly for medical reasons, though no record of any medical procedure was ever found, and between August and late October, he purchased dozens of firearms. The apocalyptic language, prosecutors argued, was both sincere delusion and convenient cover, a story the conspirators told themselves and each other so that money and freedom could wear the costume of faith. She wrote her own make-believe story, Charles's brother Jerry would say years later, and she wrote it in blood. Chapter 7. Be like Nephi. By the summer of 2019, the affair between Lori and Chad was no longer hidden, and the two unraveling marriages had become aware of each other. Charles had discovered the relationship and confronted his wife. 11 days before his death, he did something that connected the two households fatefully. He emailed Tammy Daybell to warn her that their spouses were cheating. The evidence later showed that Tammy opened the message, deleted it, and blocked Charles's email address, a small, telling act of denial from a woman who had perhaps decided not to know. On July 1st, Charles told Lori that he intended to meet Tammy in person, to compare notes, to make the betrayal undeniable. By then, Lori and Chad were communicating constantly on burner phones, and Lori had begun telling members of her religious circle that her husband had become a zombie. Some of them, she said, prayed together for Charles's death. 2 days before the killing, Lori sent her brother Alex a text message telling him to be like Nephi. In Latter-day Saint scripture, Nephi is commanded by God to kill a wicked man, Laban, for the good of the faithful, a story about righteous, divinely sanctioned killing. Investigators would later interpret the text as precisely what it appears to be on its face, an instruction, wrapped in scripture, to do what Nephi did. On the morning of July 11, 2019, Charles drove to Lori's home in Chandler, a suburb of Phoenix, to pick up JJ. He had arranged to take the boy to breakfast. He had even told a hotel employee to expect him and JJ back shortly. Alex Cox was inside the house. So was Tylee. Charles arrived a little after 7:30 a.m., running slightly late, which his brother-in-law Adam later noted was unlike the punctual Charles. An argument erupted almost at once. According to the account Cox and Lori would give, Tylee, awakened by the shouting, came into the hallway with a baseball bat to defend her mother. Charles took the bat away from her. Then, Cox claimed, Charles came at him, and Cox, having retrieved a handgun from a bedroom, shot him. Twice. Charles Vallow died on the floor of the home that morning. What happened around the killing is, in many ways, as damning as the killing itself. No one rendered aid. It was later established that Alex Cox waited roughly 43 to 45 minutes before calling 911, a span in which a wounded man might have been helped and was not. During that interval, and in the hours after, Lori's conduct was, in the later words of a Chandler detective, oddly nonchalant. She took JJ to school. She stopped at a Burger King. She stopped at a Walgreens to buy flip-flops. She texted Charles's sons from his previous marriage to tell them only that their father had passed away, and then left them in the dark for 3 days. Past teens later testified that Cox told her he did not feel bad about the shooting, because he had killed a zombie. At the time, the Chandler police treated the death as a possible case of self-defense. Cox was not arrested. No charges were filed. The scene was accepted more or less as Cox and Lori had arranged it. But prosecutors would later argue that the scene had in fact been staged, that Cox had set the house to make it appear Charles had attacked, that there was no real evidence Cox had been struck with a bat, and that the entire self-defense story was a fiction assembled around a planned execution. Within weeks, Lori contacted the insurer about Charles's roughly $1 million policy, only to learn that she was no longer the beneficiary. In early August, she filed with the Social Security Administration for survivor benefits. Charles was buried. His widow went shopping for flip-flops. And, according to the prosecution, the first step in the conspiracy had been completed. It would take years, a reopened investigation, and the discovery of 2 small graves in Idaho before the morning of July 11th was finally understood for what an Arizona jury would, in 2025, declare it to be. Not a family tragedy, but part of a coordinated murder conspiracy. The jury convicted Lori Vallow Daybell of conspiring to murder her 4th husband, finding, in effect, that the bat, the self-defense claim, and the staged hallway were lies, and accepting the prosecution's argument that Charles was killed so Lori could pursue money and marry Chad Daybell. Chapter 8. Rexburg. With Charles dead, and Lori expecting money that would never come from his policy, she moved quickly to consolidate the life she wanted. Within weeks, she relocated Tylee and JJ from Arizona to Rexburg, Idaho, to be near Chad. Her brother Alex came too, renting a unit in the same complex. Her niece Milani was nearby as well. The little household that had once revolved around Charles was now reassembling around a doomsday author who had privately told his lover that some of the people closest to her were no longer human. To the children, the move must have been disorienting. A new state, a new town, a mother increasingly consumed by a man and a mission. Tylee was 16, weeks from turning 17. By the descriptions of those who knew her, a bright, protective older sister who treated JJ almost as her own child. JJ was 7, autistic, attached to routine, dependent on the adults around him to keep his world stable and safe. Both of them had been, only recently, ordinary kids with school and family and a future. Now they had been transplanted into the center of something they could not have understood, surrounded by adults who were, in private, discussing them as obstacles. On September 8, 2019, Lori, the 2 children, and Alex Cox took a day trip to Yellowstone National Park. Photographs from that outing. Tylee near the park entrance, JJ small beside her, the ordinary snapshots of a family day, are among the last images of Tylee Ryan alive. She was 16. Within a day or so, she was gone. Phone records placed Alex Cox at Chad Daybell's property on September 9th. That same morning, Chad sent Tammy a message that would become one of the case's most infamous artifacts. He had shot a large raccoon in the backyard, he told her, and buried it in their pet cemetery. Investigators found the detail deeply suspicious. Raccoons are nocturnal. The idea of one being out to be shot and buried on a September morning, on the very day phone records put Alex Cox at the property, struck them as a cover story for fresh digging in the ground where Tylee's remains would later be found. J.J. Vallow was last seen alive on September 23, 2019 in Rexburg. He was 7 years old. After that date, the people who loved him, chiefly his biological grandmother and adoptive great-aunt, Kay Woodcock, and her husband Larry, could no longer reach him, and the answers they got from Lori grew evasive, then contradictory, then impossible. A grandmother's persistence, in the end, is what cracked the case open. But in September and October of 2019, Lori still believed she had got away with it. The children had been killed and buried. Charles was buried. And there were 2 more obstacles to remove. Chapter 9, The Children. Tylee Ashlyn Ryan, 16. Joshua Jackson, J.J. Vallow, 7. There is no responsible way to soften what was done to Tylee and J.J., and this book will not try. The forensic findings, established when their remains were finally recovered in June 2020 and later presented to 2 juries, are these. J.J. had been asphyxiated. When his body was found, it was wrapped in plastic, a plastic bag, and duct tape over his head and mouth. He had been buried, in the words of the prosecutor who described it, in a manner that was particularly egregious. And yet, in a detail that somehow deepens rather than relieves the horror, his small body had been placed with a kind of care, beneath rocks and wooden planks, as though the person who buried him felt something while doing it. He was 7. He had survived a hard start in life, a NICU, a substance-exposed infancy, only to be killed after being placed in the care of the adults who had adopted him. Tylee's remains told a more violent story. Her body had been burned, badly. Her hands had been severed. Her bones were fractured in several places, consistent, the forensic examiners concluded, with an attempt to dismember her. She was found in pieces, in the same so-called pet cemetery referenced in the raccoon text. When investigators excavated the site, an FBI agent would later testify, they began to smell decomposition and then uncovered what he described, with terrible plainness, as charring pink flesh, at which point they understood they were unearthing a human being and set a perimeter to work the scene with care. A charm believed to belong to Tylee was recovered from the ground. DNA later tied her remains to a pickaxe and a shovel found in Chad Daybell's garage. Investigators determined that both children had died in September 2019, Tylee within a day of the Yellowstone trip, JJ around September 23rd, and that their bodies had then been concealed on Chad Daybell's property for the better part of 9 months, while the adults responsible for them went on living. During those months, Lori told a shifting series of stories. That JJ was staying with a family friend in Arizona, that he was enrolled in a special needs school, that Tylee was attending Brigham Young University, Idaho, that the children were fine and the questions were intrusive. None of it was true. There was no school enrollment, no university, no friend caring for JJ. There were only 2 graves, and a mother who, while her children lay in them, was busy arranging the rest of her life. It is worth holding, for a moment, on who these 2 were before they became evidence. Tylee Ryan was funny and fierce and devoted to her little brother, The last photographs show a teenager standing in the September light at the edge of a national park, with no idea that the people who took her there had already decided she would not come home. J.J. Vallow was a bright, particular boy who loved his routines and was adored by grandparents who had fought to stay in his life and never stopped fighting, even after he was gone. They were not abstractions in a doctrine. They were children. Everything the rest of this book describes, the trials, the verdicts, the appeals, exists because two children were murdered and hidden in the dirt, and because a grandmother refused to stop asking where they were. Chapter 10. Two more. Two further attacks bracketed the children's deaths in the autumn of 2019, and together they show how far the violence had spread beyond the immediate household, how anyone who threatened the plan, or simply suspected it, became a candidate for elimination. Brandon Boudreau. Brandon Boudreau was the ex-husband of Lori's niece Melanie. Melanie had grown close to her aunt, and to the group's beliefs, and her marriage to Brandon had collapsed amid that estrangement. Brandon, meanwhile, had begun to suspect that Lori and Alex were responsible for Charles Vallow's death, a dangerous thing to suspect about people who solve their problems with a rifle. In July, prosecutors said Lori organized a casting against Brandon, telling Melanie he was a very high dark, part of Hitler's group. He had been marked. On October 2, 2019, as Brandon drove up to his home in Gilbert, another Phoenix suburb, someone in a Jeep fired a rifle shot at him through an open window. The bullet missed his head by inches and shattered a window of his car. Brandon recognized the Jeep. It was the vehicle his former niece by marriage Tylee Ryan had regularly driven. He managed to give police a partial plate, and the vehicle was traced. It was registered to Charles Vallow, and prosecutors later said Lori had loaned it to Alex Cox. The Jeep itself was located on November 4th. Brandon survived, but he understood at once what had nearly happened, and he went into hiding with his children, convinced, correctly, that someone wanted him dead. Years later, an Arizona jury would convict Lori of conspiring to murder him. Tammy Daybell. The attack on Tammy Daybell came in two stages. On October 9, 2019, Tammy called 911 to report that someone had shot at her outside her home. She described what she thought might have been a paintball gun. She was unhurt. Alex Cox's phone had pinged near the Daybell residence about 4 hours earlier. Investigators later found at Cox's home an AR-15 rifle resembling what Tammy had described, along with internet searches Cox had made about the weapon and about how a particular round would penetrate a Dodge Dakota, the make of vehicle the Daybells owned. Prosecutors concluded that the paintball gun had in fact been a real firearm that jammed or misfired, and that the would-be shooter was almost certainly Alex Cox. The first attempt on Tammy's life had failed. On the same night, Pastines testified, Lori and Melanie had been performing a casting against her. 10 days later, the failure was corrected. On October 19, 2019, Tammy Daybell was found dead in the bedroom of the family's home outside Rexburg. She was 49. Her son Garth, home that night, later described hearing a thump and then his father shouting for help in a voice of panic he had never heard before. Tammy was already gone. Chad told police that Tammy had been ill and had died in her sleep. Acting on the family's stated wishes and Chad's account of her health, the coroner did not order an autopsy and treated the death as natural, an apparent heart attack. Chad's phone, that night, pinged in the same area where Alex's had pinged before. It would later emerge that Chad had increased Tammy's life insurance coverage in the month before she died, naming himself the beneficiary, and that her death paid out roughly $430,000. Investigators recovered text messages in which Chad and Lori discussed Tammy as being in limbo, possessed by a spirit they named Viola, and, ultimately, as a zombie. Roughly a day after reporting his wife's death, Chad messaged Lori, "I know exactly how you feel." When Tammy's body was eventually exhumed and properly examined, the cause of death would be reclassified as homicide, asphyxiation. Bruising on her arms, sustained around the time she died, was consistent with someone having been restrained. The librarian who had anchored her family for nearly 3 decades had been suffocated in her own bed. Chapter 11. The Quick Wedding. The detail that, more than any other, told investigators they were looking at motive rather than misfortune was the timing of what came next. 2 weeks after Tammy Daybell's death, only days after her funeral, Chad Daybell married Lori Vallow on a beach in Hawaii. To the people around them, the speed was obscene. Tammy's children were still in the rawest stage of grief. Her body was barely in the ground. And here was their father, on a Kauai beach, in casual island clothes, marrying the woman whose own husband had been shot to death 4 months earlier, and whose 2 children had not been seen since September. Wedding photographs from that day would later be shown to an Idaho jury alongside the graphic images of what had been done to Tylee and JJ. One alternate juror, after seeing those photographs side by side, the smiling newlyweds and the murdered children whose deaths had cleared the way for the wedding, would describe Lori in a single word: a monster. For Lori, the marriage was the culmination of everything the doctrine had promised. The obstacles were gone. Charles was dead, and Lori had tried to claim the policy she believed would pay to her. Tammy was dead, and Chad had collected on the policy he had increased before her death. The children, recategorized as dark, were in the ground. And the man who had told her they had been married across 31 lifetimes was now, at last, her husband in this one. She had her eternal companion and her cosmic mission, and, not incidentally, a great deal of money. From inside the story she had built, this was not horror. It was destiny fulfilled. That gap, between what it was and what she believed it to be, is the abyss at the center of the entire case. The prosecution argued that the sequence of deaths and attempted killing reflected a plan coming together. But the plan had a flaw she had underestimated, and its name was Kay Woodcock. While Lori and Chad honeymooned and prophesied, a grandmother in Louisiana and then Arizona was making phone calls, demanding a welfare check, refusing to be told that everything was fine. The newlyweds did not yet know it, but those events had set in motion an investigation that would, within a year, dig up their backyard and end both their lives as free people. The wedding on the beach was not the beginning of a new life. It was the high water mark before the flood. Chapter 12. Where are the kids? The case that would eventually expose 4 murders began, almost mundanely, with the grandparents' refusal to be reassured. By late November 2019, Kay and Larry Woodcock, unable to reach JJ for weeks, alarmed by the silence and the deflections, had had enough. The Woodcocks asked authorities to perform a welfare check on the boy. On November 26, 2019, 2 detectives from the Rexburg Police Department went to Lori's apartment to lay eyes on JJ. What they encountered was a wall of lies. Outside the home they spoke with Alex Cox and with Chad Daybell, whom Lori had married only weeks earlier. According to the police affidavit, Chad behaved bizarrely, acting, the detectives wrote, as if he barely knew Lori, claiming he did not even know her phone number, distancing himself from the woman he had just married. Alex told the detectives that JJ was with his grandmother, Kay Woodcock, in Louisiana, a statement the police immediately recognized as almost certainly false, since Kay Woodcock was the very person who had requested the welfare check because she could not find the boy. When detectives located Lori later that day, she offered a different story. JJ, she said, was staying with a family friend in Gilbert, Arizona. That friend, Melanie Gibb, would later tell investigators that both Lori and Chad had contacted her separately and asked her to lie to police, to falsely claim she had JJ. Police could find no evidence for any of Lori's accounts. No special needs school enrollment for JJ, no BYU, Idaho enrollment for Tylee, no friend actually caring for the boy. The detectives left uneasy and resolved to come back with warrants. When they returned the next morning, November 27th, Lori and Chad were gone. They had vacated in haste. The master bedroom closet, an officer later testified, had been emptied of clothes, the unmistakable sign of people who had fled. Police served a no-knock warrant on the apartment and additional warrants on units connected to Alex Cox and to Lori's niece Melanie. In a storage locker they found belongings left behind by the children, clothing, bikes, photographs, and surveillance footage showed Lori and Alex moving items in and out of that locker before her departure. By now the investigation had widened. Police were no longer looking only for JJ, but for Tylee too, and the Idaho inquiry had begun to connect to the open questions in Arizona about Charles Vallow's death and the attempt on Brandon Boudreaux. The next weeks brought a cascade. In December, citing a suspicious death, authorities moved to exhume Tammy Daybell. On December 11, 2019, her body was disinterred for the autopsy that should have been performed the first time, and the examination concluded she had died at the hands of another, asphyxiated, with bruising consistent with restraint. The day before the exhumation, on December 10th, Lori and Chad told Alex Cox that Tammy's body was going to be dug up. According to Pastines, Alex grew visibly uneasy in his final days. He told her where to find money if he died, and he confided, darkly, that he thought he was being set up as Lori and Chad's fall guy. On December 12th, 2019, one day after the exhumation, 2 days after being told it was coming, Alex Cox died. The cause was determined to be natural. Blood clots in his lungs, complicated by high blood pressure. The man who had pulled the trigger on Charles Vallow, who had been placed by phone records at the children's burial site, and who is believed to have fired at both Brandon Boudreaux and Tammy Daybell, would never be charged with anything. Weeks earlier, on November 24th, Chad had pronounced over Alex a patriarchal blessing, a sacred Latter-day Saint rite he had no authority to perform, calling Alex a prophet and hero who had helped him and Lori in ways that can never be repaid. Investigators found the recording of that blessing on Lori's iCloud account. Prosecutors argued that the recording supported their theory of Alex Cox's role in the conspiracy. On December 20th, 2019, the Rexburg Police Department went public. It announced that JJ and Tylee were officially missing, asked for the nation's help in finding them, and stated plainly that the children were not with Lori and Chad, that Lori had refused to cooperate, and that the disappearances might be connected to Tammy Daybell's suspicious death. Family members announced a $20,000 reward. The story detonated into national news. Thousands of strangers joined online groups under the hashtag that would come to define the case. Where are the kids? A Dateline episode tried to untangle the growing web of deaths. And the two people who knew exactly where the children were said nothing, because they were no longer in Idaho at all. They had traveled to Hawaii. Chapter 13, Hawaii. Sometime in early December 2019, as the investigation closed around them in Idaho, Lori and Chad flew to Kauai, the lush, northern Hawaiian island where Chad had a connection and where Lori had once lived with Charles. They settled in the affluent resort area of Princeville, on the island's north shore, and for a strange, suspended stretch of weeks they lived something close to a honeymoon while, 4,000 miles away, search volunteers combed the Idaho cold for the children buried in Chad's backyard. They were not, in fact, hiding or not well. Kauai police had been watching the couple since shortly after they arrived on the island, building the case and coordinating with Idaho authorities. The surveillance produced its own surreal counterpoint to the search back home. The newlyweds shopping, walking the beach, behaving for all the world like an ordinary couple on vacation, while the question, where are the kids, consumed the mainland. Their apparent serenity, set against the desperation of the families, would become one of the case's enduring images of cruelty. On January 25th and 26th, 2020, the unreality broke into the open. Nate Eaton, a journalist with EastIdahoNews.com who had covered the case from the start, traveled to Hawaii and found Lori and Chad in a parking lot. He approached them with a camera and asked the questions the whole country was asking. Where are your children? What happened to them? Don't you want to clear this up? Lori and Chad said almost nothing. They deflected, they smiled tightly, they walked away. The footage of that encounter, a mother declining on camera to say where her missing 7-year-old and 16-year-old were, is among the most watched and most chilling artifacts of the case. It is the sound of a wall. The legal pressure was, by then, mounting fast. Idaho authorities had obtained a court order requiring Lori to physically produce the children before the court in Madison County by a hard deadline, January 30th, 2020. The order was the system's blunt instrument for forcing the issue: produce the kids, alive, and let everyone see them. January 30th came and went. Lori produced no one. Kay Woodcock held a news conference to voice her anguish and disappointment. There were, of course, no children to produce. They had been dead since September. On February 20th, 2020, the waiting ended. Acting on a warrant out of Madison County, Idaho, the Kauai Police Department arrested Lori, by then legally Lori Vallow Daybell, on Queen Emma Drive in Princeville. She was charged with 2 felony counts of desertion and non-support of dependent children, along with 3 misdemeanors: resisting or obstructing officers, criminal solicitation to commit a crime, and contempt of court. Her bail was set, startlingly high for the charges, at $5 million. She was booked into the Kauai jail and then transferred to a correctional center on the island. For Kay and Larry Woodcock, the arrest was, in Larry's word, bittersweet. It was, Kay said, a step forward, but the one question that mattered was still unanswered. We are elated. We are relieved, she told a reporter. We are ready for the next step, which for Lori is: where are the kids? Where are the kids? Where are the kids? Tylee's aunt, Annie Cushing, put the public's hardening mood into sharper words, predicting that Lori would not be able to charm her way through this one, that the highlights and the beach waves and the easy laugh would not work where she was going. At her first court appearances on Kauai, Lori was subdued, answering the judge in nods and quiet, one-word replies, appearing in an orange jail uniform with Chad seated in the gallery in a blue tie. Her attorney argued that the $5 million bail was wildly excessive for a Class B felony, that Lori had moved to Hawaii in a relocation planned before the charges were filed, that she was not a flight risk, and that she had not fled even while under weeks of surveillance. The judge was unmoved and left the bail in place. On February 26, after 6 days in custody, Lori waived her right to fight extradition, signaling she would return to Idaho, and on March 5, 2020, she was flown back to face the Madison County charges. Her bail was later reduced to $1 million, but she could not make it. Multiple local bond companies, it was reported, simply refused to work with her. Chad, notably, was not arrested in Hawaii. He had married into the children's lives, but he was not their father and faced no desertion charge. He was questioned and released. He soon returned to Idaho himself, where, in one of the case's stranger footnotes, he tried to convince members of the religious circle, the Gilberts, to put up their home as collateral to bond Lori out of jail, claiming that the idea had come to him from Jesus. It did not work. Lori stayed in custody, and the search for Tylee and JJ ground on into the spring of 2020, the families bracing, by now, for the answer everyone feared and no one wanted to say aloud. Chapter 14. The Bodies in the Backyard. Chad Daybell's property near Salem, in Fremont County, Idaho, had already been searched once. On January 3, 2020, a multi-agency raid had removed 43 items from the home. Officers had gone over portions of the yard with metal detectors, probes, and rakes, and searched a shed. They had not, that day, found the children. But the investigation kept tightening, and by late spring the authorities had what they needed to go back. On the morning of Tuesday, June 9, 2020, at about 7 o'clock, officers from the Rexburg Police Department and the Fremont County Sheriff's Office, joined by roughly 20 members of the FBI's evidence response team, converged on Chad Daybell's home to execute a sealed search warrant. Chad's car was stopped about a mile from the property, and he was taken into custody. As the search got underway, an EastIdahoNews.com helicopter circled overhead and broadcast images that the country watched in real time and dread. A backhoe in the backyard, blue tarps spread across the ground, canopies, a cadaver dog. The aerial shots of those 3 blue tarps behind a house told the story before any official said a word. Inside the perimeter, investigators were doing the painstaking, terrible work of excavation. An FBI agent, Steve Daniels, would later testify in unflinching detail about what they found. As they dug, they began to smell decomposing remains, and they slowed down, working carefully to preserve evidence of how the bodies had been buried. They recovered pieces of Tylee's body and placed them in a body bag. When they reached what Daniels described as charring pink flesh, and understood they were uncovering a burned human body, they set a perimeter and planned to return the next day to finish. They examined and seized hand tools from the property. A pick that could have been used in the fire pit, a yellow and black-handled shovel caked with dirt. The ordinary implements of a yard turned into the instruments of a concealment. A charm believed to have belonged to 16-year-old Tylee was recovered from the earth. That evening, the family's worst expectation became official. Chad Daybell was arrested and charged with 2 felony counts of concealment or destruction of evidence. 1 count alleging he had hidden, altered, or destroyed human remains on his property between September 8, 2019 and June 9, 2020, the other covering the period from September 22. Each carried up to 5 years. At a hearing the next day, with Chad's bail set at $1 million, the prosecutor told the court bluntly that the remains are children, and noted that the concealment of one of the bodies had been particularly egregious. The Woodcock and Ryan families issued a joint statement confirming what they had been told. The remains were JJ and Tylee. Annie Cushing wrote that the discovery marked the conclusion of a long and arduous search for her niece and the boys she had mothered, an outcome that came, she said, as no surprise and yet still packs a devastating punch as the finality of it all sinks in. Over the following days the remains were taken to the medical examiner's office in Boise, where autopsies and positive identifications were performed. On June 13, 2020, the Rexburg Police Department confirmed officially, with heavy hearts, that the bodies were those of Joshua J.J. Vallow and Tylee Ryan. The mayor of Rexburg called it a sad day for the town. The hashtag that had carried millions of strangers' hopes, "Where are the kids?" had finally been answered, in the worst possible way. The kids had been in Chad Daybell's backyard the entire time. Through the welfare check, through the flight to Hawaii, through the beach wedding, through the extradition fight, through every false story Lori told about schools and friends, and a daughter at university. They had never left. They had been in the ground, a few yards from the house, while the adults who put them there married, prophesied, and insisted they had done nothing wrong. With the children found and identified, the case transformed overnight from a missing persons mystery into a multiple murder prosecution. The relatively minor desertion charges against Lori and the concealment charges against Chad were placeholders. What was coming was far graver. On May 24th and 25th, 2021, a Fremont County grand jury indicted both Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell on charges of first-degree murder in the deaths of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy Daybell, together with conspiracy to commit murder. Lori was additionally charged with grand theft for collecting the children's Social Security survivor benefits after they were already dead. Chad faced insurance fraud charges connected to Tammy's policy. That August, prosecutors announced they would seek the death penalty against both. The reckoning, so long delayed, had finally begun. Chapter 15, Competency and Delay. Justice in the Vallow Daybell case did not come quickly, and the reasons it did not are themselves part of the story, and, later, part of the appeal. From indictment to Lori's first trial would take nearly 2 years, a span shaped by genuine legal complexity, by a fight over her lawyer, and above all by serious questions about whether Lori Vallow Daybell was mentally competent to stand trial at all. A trial on the early Madison County charges had initially been set for January 2021. But on May 27, 2021, just days after the murder indictment came down, Lori was found incompetent and unfit to stand trial, and her case was stayed. She was committed to the custody of the state for mental health treatment, where she would remain for roughly 10 months. On April 11, 2022, after that treatment, she was deemed competent and the prosecution resumed. The competency question did not vanish cleanly, however. The proceedings around it, what the court decided, and when, while her competency was unsettled, would later become one of the central pillars of her appeal. Entangled with the competency issue was a fight over counsel. After her extradition, Lori had hired an attorney named Mark Means. But Means had also briefly represented Chad Daybell, and in December 2021 the court disqualified Means from Lori's case, finding that his prior representation of her co-defendant created an unwaivable conflict of interest, a conflict sharpened by the fact that Means had himself become a potential witness and had no experience in capital cases. The manner of that disqualification, and the hearings around it, would also become a core appellate claim. For now, it meant Lori lost the lawyer she had chosen and was assigned new counsel as the case ground forward. 2 more pretrial developments shaped what the juries would ultimately see. First, on March 2, 2023, the court severed Lori's and Chad's cases, so that the two would be tried separately rather than together, a decision that would let each be judged on the evidence specific to them, and that would, in practice, send Lori to trial first. Second, on March 21, 2023, shortly before her trial, prosecutors withdrew the death penalty against Lori. The reason was not mercy, but sanction. The state had committed a discovery violation, a failure to turn over evidence in a timely way, and the court's remedy was to take execution off the table in her case. The asymmetry that resulted, Lori facing life, Chad still facing death, would later feature in Chad's own defense, whose lawyers argued he was less culpable than the woman who had, in their telling, manipulated him, and who did not face the ultimate penalty. The venue, meanwhile, had been moved from rural Fremont County to Ada County in Boise to find jurors untainted by years of saturating local coverage, a transfer that required extensive security and logistical planning and added months to the timeline. By the spring of 2023, after all of it, Lori Vallow Daybell was finally ready to be tried for murder. Chapter 16. The Idaho Trial of Lori Vallow Daybell. Lori Vallow Daybell's trial began in April 2023 in a Boise courtroom, before a jury that had been carefully screened from the national frenzy surrounding the case. Over roughly 6 weeks, the prosecution laid out a narrative built not on a single smoking gun, but on an accumulation. Phone records, financial trails, forensic findings, and, most powerfully, the testimony of the people who had been inside Lori's world and watched it curdle. The witnesses formed a devastating chorus. Melanie Gibb, once Lori's close friend and podcast co-host, described the group's beliefs, Lori's transformation, and the request that she lie to police about JJ. Zulema Pastines, Alex Cox's widow, testified about her late husband's descent under Chad and Lori's influence, how he had been convinced he was a reincarnated warrior of God, and about the castings, including the one performed on the night Tammy was attacked. Audrey Barachero described being threatened with murder and disposal in trash bags when she tried to leave the group. Ian Pulowski, who had married Lori's niece Melanie, testified about the beliefs from the inside. Kay Woodcock spoke for the grandson she had fought to protect. Adam Cox, Lori's own surviving brother, told the jury he had no doubt his sister had conspired with Alex to kill Charles, and that Lori had told people Charles was no longer living, that a zombie occupied his body. Other witnesses filled in the texture of Lori's transformation. April Raymond, who had taught Sunday school scriptures alongside Lori at a Latter-day Saint congregation in Hawaii, testified that Lori had confided her belief that Charles was possessed, inhabited by a spirit she named, in one of the case's many interchangeable demon names, Ned Snyder. Raymond said that in hindsight, she felt Lori had been subtly grooming her during a 2019 visit, steadily pressing the belief system on a friend she hoped to bring inside the circle. Witness by witness, the jury watched the same arc retold from different vantage points. A warm, devout woman who, beginning around 2018, came to regard the people closest to her as spirits to be cast out, obstacles to be removed, zombies to be released. And then there was Summer Shiflett, Lori's younger sister, whose testimony delivered the trial's most piercing moment. Jurors heard a recorded jailhouse phone call, in which Summer confronted Lori after the children's bodies had been found. Across the line between the free world and the cell, a sister said the thing the whole country had been thinking. You threw them away like garbage. The documentary evidence was as damning as the human testimony. Jurors saw the text messages, the "Be like Nephi" command to Alex, the exchange in which Lori asked Chad whether there was a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children, and Chad replied that there was, that he had been shown last night how it fit together. The messages referring to working on Z's. Zombies. The romantic exchanges between the lovers conducted against the backdrop of the deaths. They learned that Tammy Daybell's autopsy, after exhumation, showed asphyxiation. They learned that Lori's DNA and Alex Cox's fingerprints were connected to the crimes, and that Tylee's DNA had been found on tools from Chad's garage. They saw the wedding photographs from Hawaii, the smiling newlyweds, placed beside the photographs of what had been done to the children. Lori, for her part, presented no defense witnesses and did not testify. On May 12, 2023, after the 6-week trial, the jury returned its verdict. Guilty, on every count. Lori Vallow Daybell was convicted of the first-degree murders of Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow, of conspiracy to commit first-degree murder in the deaths of the 2 children and of Tammy Daybell, and of grand theft for stealing the children's survivor benefits. She stood, as the verdicts were read, and showed the courtroom almost nothing. On July 31, 2023, District Judge Stephen Boyce sentenced her. For the murders and the conspiracies, he imposed multiple life sentences without the possibility of parole, 3 of them ordered to run consecutively, ensuring she would die in prison. He also ordered her, though indigent, to pay $165,018 in fines and court costs. The Doomsday Mom was sent to the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center to begin sentences that, barring a successful appeal, would never end. For the families of Tylee and JJ, it was a measure of justice. It was not, and could never be, a restoration. The children were still gone. Chapter 17, Chad Daybell's Reckoning. Chad Daybell went to trial a year later, and unlike Lori, he still faced the death penalty. His trial opened on April 10, 2024, in Boise. The prosecution's theory was the same conspiracy scene from its other hub, where Lori supplied the will, the family access, and the emotional and sexual pull. Chad supplied the doctrine, the casting of people as dark, the death percentages, the religious permission structure that turned murder into salvation, and a backyard in which to bury the dead. In his opening statement, Prosecutor Rob Wood depicted Chad as a man driven by sex, money, and power, a man craving significance who saw his wife and his lover's children as obstacles to his rightful destiny. Chad's defense attorney, John Pryor, painted a different picture, a credulous, religious man who had been lured and manipulated by Lori Vallow. Prosecutor Lindsay Blake laid out the lethal pattern in her closing. A target would be labeled dark by Chad, their death percentage would drop, and then they would die. She argued that Chad had influenced the coroner's initial ruling on Tammy by fabricating details about her health, clearing the way for the death to be written off as natural. She pointed to the timing of a life insurance increase and payout. The policy had been increased the month before Tammy died, and to the text exchange in which Lori asked about a perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children, and Chad answered that a plan was being orchestrated, that he had been shown how it fit together. She pointed to Tylee's DNA on the pick and shovel from Chad's garage. The picture she assembled was of a man who had used the language of prophecy as a tool and a backyard as a grave. Chad's adult children testified in his defense, insisting their father had genuinely grieved their mother and had nothing to do with any of the deaths. His daughter, Emma Murray, described him as more distressed than she had ever seen him after Tammy died, and his son Garth said he had heard no disturbance the night his mother died and felt pressured by investigators to change his account. The defense also leaned on forensic experts. A defense forensic pathologist, Dr. Kathy Raven, testified that Tammy's cause of death should, in her view, have been classified as undetermined. A DNA expert, Dr. Greg Hempikian, told the jury that Chad's DNA was absent from the evidence he tested. A data forensics examiner, Patrick Eller, testified that Chad's own phone was not present on the property when Alex Cox's device pinged there on the key September dates, though prosecutors noted that Chad used multiple phones. The Daybell children have continued, to this day, to assert their father's innocence, maintaining that he too was deceived by Lori. But the jury was not persuaded. On May 30, 2024, after deliberating less than a day, the jury, 10 men and 8 women, found Chad Daybell guilty on every count. The first-degree murders of Tammy Daybell, Tylee Ryan, and J.J. Vallow, conspiracy, grand theft, and 2 counts of insurance fraud related to the roughly $430,000 in policies he had held on Tammy. He stood, as Lori had a year earlier, with a blank expression as the verdicts were read. The penalty phase. Because the state had sought death, the same jury now moved into a second phase to decide whether Chad Daybell should live or die. In Idaho, the jurors would have to find at least one statutory aggravating factor on each murder count, and then conclude that the aggravation, weighed against any mitigation, did not make a death sentence unjust. Prosecutor Robb would lay out the aggravators the state believed the evidence had proven, that the murders were especially heinous, atrocious, or cruel, manifesting exceptional depravity, that Chad had exhibited an utter disregard for human life, and that his conduct showed a propensity to commit murder that would constitute a continuing threat. It didn't matter the age of the victim or who relied on them and loved them, Prosecutor Lindsay Blake told the jury. If they were in the way of Chad and his plan, or if there was money to be gained for Lori and Chad, those individuals were marked for death. Blake walked the jurors through a chilling financial timeline. Tylee died about 2 weeks after Lori received the first survivor benefit payment redirected into an account in her name alone. JJ died days after the first payments for his benefits arrived. Tammy died about a month after her life insurance was increased, and she played for the courtroom the last short videos of JJ and Tylee, recorded the day before they died, alongside a recording of Tammy Daybell simply introducing herself. Chad's defense chose, strikingly, to present no mitigation evidence at all. Attorney John Pryor instead made his case in argument, blaming Lori for everything. He pointed to a quiet, church-going, scouting-involved family man with 29 years of marriage and not so much as a speeding ticket, and argued that everything changed around Christmas of 2018, when a bomb came into his life. Lori Vallow glittered. She was not gold, Pryor told the jury. She was the trajectory that changed the plan. He insisted the case had nothing to do with money, that the doctrine was Lori's, and that Chad had never even been present when the children were killed. Chad himself declined to address the court. Then the families spoke. 9 victim impact statements were delivered for Tammy, Tylee, and JJ. Tammy's brother, Michael Douglas, said the nightmare he had been handed would last him a lifetime. Her sister-in-law, Kelsey Douglas, spoke of a legacy of anguish and sorrow that will haunt our family for generations. Tylee's aunt, Annie Cushing, called the case death by 1,000 cuts, and remembered Tylee as intelligent, clever, funny, sarcastic, a girl with the voice of an angel. Kay Woodcock spoke of JJ. Born a fighter, his weeks in intensive care, his high reading level, the gumbo they made together, and of a grief that arrived in waves with every milestone he would never reach. The constant question remains, she said, who would he have become? Colby Ryan, who had now buried his entire immediate family, told the jurors he stood before them motherless, fatherless, sisterless, and brotherless, the loss, like a nuclear bomb dropping. On June 1, 2024, the jury returned its recommendation: death, on each of the murder counts. Judge Stephen Boyce adopted it, finding that the aggravating circumstances, weighed against the mitigating ones, did not make the death penalty unjust, and formally sentenced Chad Daybell to death, adding 15 years for each insurance fraud conviction. Chad Daybell, the gravedigger turned doomsday author who had told a lonely, grandiose woman that they'd been married across 31 lifetimes, was sent to Idaho's death row, joining a small population of condemned men in a state that rarely carries out executions. The 2 architects of the killings were now both convicted murderers, one facing life, the other facing death. What did they accomplish? Nothing, Larry Woodcock said outside the courthouse. What did they do? They destroyed families. Then he turned towards what was coming next. I'll see y'all in Arizona, he said. Lori's legal odyssey was not over. Arizona was waiting. Chapter 18, Arizona. Lori Vallow Daybell's convictions in Idaho did not exhaust her criminal exposure. 2 crimes had been committed in Arizona: the murder of Charles Vallow in Chandler and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux in Gilbert, and Maricopa County prosecutors intended to try her for both. After her Idaho sentencing, she was extradited to Arizona to face 2 separate trials in the spring of 2025. In a decision that defined both proceedings, Lori chose to represent herself, despite having no legal training whatsoever. She clashed repeatedly with the presiding judge, Justin Beresky, and made unsuccessful attempts to have him removed for alleged bias. The self-representation produced a string of strange courtroom moments. In her opening statement at the Charles Vallow trial, she leaned on a single incantatory refrain, reportedly using the phrase, "the evidence will show," more than 70 times, and she insisted that Alex Cox had shot Charles in self-defense, that what happened was a family tragedy, not a crime. "Self-defense is not a crime," she told the jury, her voice breaking as she described the baseball bat. "Family tragedy is not a crime, it's a tragedy." At one point she aggressively cross-examined a woman who had gone on a date with Charles the day before he was killed, asking whether she made a habit of dating married men. At another, the judge removed her from the courtroom after she became combative during arguments about her own character, having been warned that to call herself a person of great character could open the door to evidence of her Idaho convictions. The prosecution offered the jury a colder, simpler arithmetic. "Lori Vallow is why Alex was able to shoot Charles," prosecutor Trina Kay told them. "Lori Vallow is why Charles is dead." The motives, the state argued, were the most ordinary ones in any murder case: money and sex, the $1 million life insurance policy Lori believed she would receive, and the freedom to stop being Lori Vallow and become Lori Daybell. She could marry Chad Daybell and become Lori Daybell. She would get a $1 million life insurance policy, Kay said. Her own brother Adam, again testifying for the prosecution, said he had no doubt she and Alex were behind Charles's death. A killing that had come, he noted, just as he and Charles were planning an intervention to pull Lori back towards the mainstream of their shared faith. On April 22, 2025, the jury convicted Lori of conspiring to commit the first-degree murder of Charles Vallow. Less than 2 months later, in her second Arizona trial, she was convicted again, on June 12, 2025, of conspiring to murder Brandon Boudreaux. She had represented herself in that trial too, telling jurors in her opening that she had nothing to do with the rifle shot fired from Tylee's Jeep. They did not believe her. On July 25, 2025, Judge Beresky sentenced Lori in both Arizona cases. Before he did, the people she had hurt spoke. Her only surviving child, Colby Ryan, testifying by remote link, described how he had to fight to stay alive after the pain of losing his father and his siblings, and recounted how he had at first been told his father died of a heart attack, only to arrive and learn Charles had been shot, how his mother had turned him against his father with a lie about an affair, when the affair, it turned out, had been hers all along. Then he delivered the line that distilled the entire catastrophe. "I believe that Lori Vallow herself is the family tragedy." Brandon Boudreaux, who said he had forgiven Lori so that he could be a better person, but would never feel safe while she was free, told the court tearfully, "No one deserves to live a life of fear and trauma." Jerry Vallow, Charles's brother, was unsparing. "She wrote her own make-believe story, and she wrote it in blood. And she tried to kill Brandon when he started looking like the next available dollar sign." Lori, given the chance to speak, maintained her innocence to the last. "I want everyone to know that I mourn with all of you. I am sorry for your pain," she said, offering empathy while denying she had caused the deaths. "If I were accountable for these crimes, I would acknowledge it." The judge rejected her claim that she had been denied a fair trial. "You have not victimized just a single victim, but many," Beresky told her. "You've shattered lives. You've undermined trust." He imposed 2 life sentences, each carrying the possibility of parole only after 25 years, to be served consecutively to each other, and consecutively, as well, to the life term she was already serving in Idaho. The Arizona trial and sentencing chapter was closed. Lori would be returned to Idaho, the Maricopa County attorney said, knowing she didn't get away with her crimes committed in Maricopa County. For Lori, 3 juries, 2 states, 5 victims, and 1 verdict had been rendered over and over: guilty. Chapter 19. The Appeals and Where Things Stand. Conviction is not the end of a criminal case in the United States, and Lori Vallow Daybell has not stopped fighting. As of this 2026 edition, her case remained active in the appellate courts of both states, even as she served out a stack of life sentences that, on their face, left no path to freedom. This chapter sets out, as precisely as the public record allowed at the time of writing, what those appeals argued and where they stood. The Idaho Appeal. Lori first filed notice of appeal in Idaho in September 2023, shortly after her sentencing. Her appellate attorney, Craig H. Durham of Boise, filed an opening brief with the Idaho Supreme Court in 2025, asking the court either to overturn her 2023 convictions outright or to grant her a new trial. The brief rests on 5 principal claims of constitutional and procedural error, counsel of choice. That the trial court violated her Sixth Amendment right to the attorney of her choosing by disqualifying her retained lawyer. Mark means removal the defense characterizes as a structural error that taints the whole proceeding. The brief argues that the disqualification came at a critical stage and that her right to choose her own advocate is, in Durham's words, a bedrock principle of the Sixth Amendment. Assistance of counsel at the disqualification hearings. That she was effectively denied counsel during the very hearings on Means's disqualification because the court refused to let Means participate in proceedings that were conducted, in part, within Chad Daybell's separate case, leaving her rights to be decided in a forum where her lawyer could only watch. Due process and competency. That the court violated her 14th Amendment right to due process by holding pretrial hearings that affected her substantial rights while she was absent and had been found incompetent to stand trial, a period during which, the defense argues, she was entitled to protection from adjudications she could not understand or assist in. Evidentiary error. That the trial court improperly admitted evidence of the uncharged Arizona conduct, the Charles Vallow and Brandon Boudreaux matters, under Idaho's Rule 404B, allowing the jury to hear of other alleged bad acts. Speedy trial. That the roughly 2-year gap between indictment and trial violated her statutory and constitutional rights to a speedy trial. The state of Idaho has pushed back firmly. In a brief filed in early 2026, a deputy attorney general argued that the trial court handled each issue properly. On the speedy trial claim in particular, the state emphasized the genuine complexity of a multi-defendant capital case involving voluminous discovery, multiple victims, and a venue change requiring elaborate security and logistical planning, and pointed out that much of the delay was attributable to Lori's own motions, including her successful push to move the trial to Ada County. Public reporting available for this edition did not show a decision disturbing the Idaho verdicts. The justices may ultimately uphold the convictions, order a new trial, or grant some other relief. Until they rule otherwise, the verdicts and sentences stand, and Lori remains incarcerated in Idaho. The Arizona Appeals. Lori has also moved to challenge her 2 Arizona conspiracy convictions, which followed the ordinary post-conviction path in that state and were in their early stages as of this 2026 edition. Her decision to represent herself at both Arizona trials, and her repeated, failed efforts to disqualify Judge Boreski for alleged bias, are among the issues likely to feature in any appellate review. Chad Daybell's appeal. Chad Daybell, sentenced to death in 2024, has appealed as well. Capital cases in Idaho carry an automatic, lengthy appellate review. As of 2026, he remained on death row while that process unfolded. His adult children have continued to assert his innocence, maintaining that he, too, was deceived by Lori. The legal process remains ongoing and may continue for years. But it is important to be clear about what the appeals do and do not contest. They argue about how Lori was tried, which lawyer she had, what the jury was allowed to hear, how long the wait, whether the process respected her rights at every step. Those are real and serious questions, and a higher court may yet find merit in one or more of them. What the appeals do not offer is any innocent account of why 5 people were attacked and 4 of them died. The core allegations were accepted by multiple juries across 2 states. Lori Vallow Daybell has been convicted of murdering her 2 youngest children, of conspiring in the murder of Tammy Daybell, and of conspiring to murder Charles Vallow and Brandon Boudreaux, her niece's ex-husband. The procedural battles continue, but the verdicts remain in effect unless an appellate court orders otherwise. Chapter 20. The Prophecy Marketplace. To understand how an apparently faithful Latter-day Saint mother came to believe she was a goddess casting out zombies, it helps to understand the strange spiritual ecosystem she fell into, a subculture that existed at the far edge of her church, drew on ideas the church itself rejects, and supplied both the vocabulary and the social permission for what she and Chad Daybell would do. Scholars of Mormonism describe a loose, sprawling prophecy subculture within and around the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints. End-times teachers, self-described visionaries, and prepper communities who, marginalized by mainstream church leadership, retreated into their own digital spaces, forums, podcasts, conference circuits. The religious studies scholar Christopher James Blythe has cautioned against calling these figures cult leaders in the mold of a David Koresh or a Jim Jones. The subculture, he argues, functions less like a single controlling organization than like a marketplace for consumers of prophecy, in which seekers shop among competing visionaries. Most participants considered themselves devoutly faithful members of the church even as they consumed teachings the church had never endorsed. What made the marketplace dangerous was not that it was a cult, but that it was unregulated. A space where ideas borrowed from New Age spirituality, energy healing, and survivalist prepping could be blended with scripture and sold as revelation, with no institutional break on how far any individual might run with them. A central figure in that world, and a direct link to Chad Daybell, was Julie Rowe. Rowe claimed to have undergone a near-death experience in 2004 in which her spirit entered the spirit world and received visions of biblical history and of coming apocalyptic calamities. Earthquakes, tsunamis, famines, plagues, wars, followed by the establishment of refuges and cities of light before the Second Coming. She published these claims in self-released books such as A Greater Tomorrow, 2014, framing them in a Latter-day Saint idiom and urging spiritual preparation and relocation to safe havens. Her teachings found a startlingly large audience. By some accounts, her predictions of a 2015 civil war and economic collapse prompted 10,000 or more adherents to make drastic life changes, quitting jobs, selling homes, relocating to perceived safe zones like the Ozarks or Montana's Flathead Valley, often at great financial cost when the prophesied catastrophes failed to arrive. When the timeline collapsed, believers did what believers in failed prophecy tend to do. They reinterpreted, rescheduled, and held on. Rowe was eventually excommunicated from the church in 2019, after which her audience dwindled. Chad Daybell was Julie Rowe's book publisher, and the two collaborated for years on prophetic content. Rowe would later say that she and Chad had each claimed visions, including a shared one in which angels told them Tammy Daybell would die. Chad's own platform extended beyond Rowe. He was a frequent and popular contributor to AVOW, Another Voice of Warning, a preparedness and spirituality forum run by an Idaho man named Christopher Parrott, where Chad posted about his prophetic dreams and where his writing appeared in Parrott's books. And he and Lori were speakers and podcasters for Preparing a People, a multimedia platform built around the task of readying believers for the Second Coming, which often featured dreams and visions, programming, and speakers like Rowe. It is important to state clearly what these organizations were and were not. Preparing a People, in statements after the murders, insisted it was not a cult, not a group one joins, but a producer of lecture events, and that Chad had been only an occasional unpaid speaker rather than a founder. The Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints never endorsed Preparing a People, AVOW, Rowe, or Daybell. Church leaders did not attend or speak at these events, and the church's own handbook specifically warns members against practices like energy healing that the subculture promoted. The movement was a fringe outgrowth, not an official body, a distinction the church and many of its members were at pains to make as the case turned Mormon doomsday cult into a tabloid phrase. Several specific doctrines from this milieu became load-bearing in the crimes. The idea of the 144,000, a chosen remnant drawn from the Book of Revelation and given particular emphasis in some strands of Mormon thought, became, for Lori, a personal calling. She came to believe she was a god assigned to carry out the work of the 144,000 at Christ's return, which she expected in July 2020. The notion of multiple mortal probations, effectively reincarnation, which Orthodox Latter-day Saint teaching rejects, underwrote Chad's claim to 31 past lives and his and Lori's belief that they had been married across many lifetimes. The fascination with near-death experiences, common in the subculture and traceable in Chad's own memoir to a teenage cliff-jumping accident, supplied the claim of special access to the world beyond the veil. And the practice of energy healing, paired with the language of light and dark, shaded easily into the castings and zombie doctrines that turn neighbors and children into spirits to be expelled. Lori, characteristically, took the marketplace's wares and made herself the heroine of the story. In divorce filings, Charles reported her claims that she was sealed for eternity to the ancient Book of Mormon prophet Moroni, that she had been married in a past life to James the Just, and that she had once lived as Mary French. In her telling, a natural grandmother of the church's founder, Joseph Smith. These were not doctrines she had been handed intact. They were a private mythology, assembled from the subculture's raw materials and arranged so that, at the center of the coming apocalypse, stood Lori. The marketplace gave her the pieces. She built the throne herself. Chapter 21. The Cast. A case this sprawling can blur into a tangle of names. What follows is a closer look at the people at its heart, the dead, the survivor, and the living players who shaped the story, because each of them was a person before they became a character in a true crime saga. Tylee Ashlyn Ryan. Tylee was 16, weeks from 17, when she was killed. Born in September 2002, she was Lori's daughter from her marriage to Joseph Ryan, and she had grown into a sharp, funny young woman. Intelligent, clever, funny, sarcastic, in her Aunt Annie Cushing's words, a girl with what Cushing called the voice of an angel. She had earned her GED in the fall of 2018 and drove a Jeep, the same vehicle later used in the attempt on Brandon Boudreaux's life, making the roughly $400 monthly payments on it herself. Above all, those who knew her remembered her devotion to her little brother. When JJ was adopted, Tylee threw herself into his care, mothering him, treating him as her own. The last photographs of her from the Yellowstone trip show a teenager with her whole life in front of her. Joshua J.J. Vallow. JJ was 7. Born in May 2012 and exposed to drugs in the womb, he spent his first weeks in intensive care. Born a fighter, his grandmother Kay Woodcock said, before the Woodcocks cared for him through his first year and Charles and Lori adopted him. He was autistic, and he had a service dog, a golden doodle named Bailey, trained for him by a man named Neil Mestas. The dog helped him stay calm, and the two were inseparable until, shortly before JJ disappeared, Lori returned the dog to its trainer. By the accounts of the people who loved him, JJ was bright and compassionate, a strong reader who liked making gumbo with his grandmother. He would have turned 12 the year his stepfather Chad was sentenced. The constant question remains, Kay Woodcock told a courtroom. Who would he have become? Charles Vallow. Charles was Lori's fourth husband and JJ's adoptive father, a former college baseball pitcher and fraternity man turned financial planner, generous to a fault, a provider. He had 2 sons from an earlier marriage to Cheryl Wheeler, and a brother, Jerry, who would one day speak for him in court. Charles saw the danger in Lori sooner than anyone and documented it. The past life claims, the threats, the conviction that she was a god. He obtained an order of protection and asked for a mental health evaluation. He was killed before any of it could save him, shot in the home he had once shared with the woman who had him declared a zombie. Tammy Daybell. Tammy, born Tamara Douglas, was Chad's wife of nearly 30 years and the mother of their 5 children. A school librarian, she was the steady, grounded center of the Daybell family, remembered by her children as devoted and reliable. She had reported being shot at in her own driveway 10 days before she died, and posted about it, baffled, on social media. She was suffocated in her bed at 49, after which Chad married Lori and collected on a life insurance policy he had quietly enlarged the month before. Her brother Michael Douglas told a jury that the nightmare fodder of her murder would last him a lifetime. Brandon Boudreaux. Brandon was the ex-husband of Lori's niece Melanie and the father of their 4 children. Targeted because he had grown suspicious of the family and had been marked a very high dark, he survived a rifle shot fired at his head from Tylee's Jeep in October 2019, the bullet missing by inches. He went into hiding with his children, fought a wrenching custody battle, and warned anyone who would listen that his ex-wife had fallen into something deadly. He is the one intended victim who lived, and he stood in an Arizona courtroom years later to say, through tears, that no one deserves a life of fear and trauma. Alex Cox. Alex was Lori's older brother and the hand that carried out the violence. The shooter of Charles Vallow, the man phone records placed at the children's burial site, the suspected gunman in the attacks on Brandon Boudreaux and Tammy Daybell. By his own family's account, he was not well. His sister Summer testified that a car accident had left him with brain damage and decision-making stuck at a teenage level, and his wife Zelema Pastine said he had been convinced by Chad and Lori that he was a reincarnated warrior of God whose only purpose was to protect Lori. He had married briefly in the past, and then, on November 29, 2019, married Pastines, taking her last name. He died on December 12, 2019, of natural causes. Blood clots in his lungs, just after being told Tammy's body would be exhumed, and just after confiding that he feared he was being made the fall guy. He was found unresponsive by Pastines's adult son. He was never charged with anything, because the dead cannot be tried. Melanie Gibb. Melanie Gibb was, for a time, one of Lori's closest friends and the co-host of their podcast, Feel the Fire. She was present for some of the formative moments of the belief system, and at Lori and Chad's request she initially lied to police, falsely telling them JJ was staying with her. Growing suspicious, she recorded a conversation with a couple, then recanted her statement to investigators in December 2019, a turn that helped crack the case. She became a crucial prosecution witness at both Idaho trials and a public voice on the case, telling Dateline's Keith Morrison that Lori and Chad had been gasoline and fire, equally destructive to each other. Kay and Larry Woodcock. Kay Woodcock was Charles Vallow's sister and JJ's biological grandmother. She and her husband, Larry, had cared for JJ through his first year, and a condition of his adoption was that they remain in his life. When JJ went silent in the autumn of 2019, it was Kay who demanded the welfare check that set the investigation in motion, and the Woodcocks who put up a $20,000 reward and refused, through months of evasion, to stop asking, "Where are the kids?" They became the moral center of the public case, grieving, relentless, present at every milestone. "I can't tell you the harm you have caused to our family," Larry told Lori at her Arizona sentencing, "but I can tell you this. I know where you're going to be until you die." Melanie Pawlowski. Melanie, formerly Boudreau, born to Lori's late sister Stacy, who died in 1998, was the niece Lori had helped raise, and the relative who followed her aunt deepest into the belief system. She divorced Brandon Boudreau in 2019, moved to Rexburg, lived next door to Lori, and married a man she met there, Ian Pawlowski, in late November 2019. Brandon alleged in court that she had become entangled in a lethal cult. Her own attorney insisted she had never been part of any cult and did not hold its extremist beliefs. Melanie was never charged in connection with the deaths. Her then-new husband, Ian Pawlowski, cooperated with the FBI and authored a document describing the group's beliefs about zombies and possession that became part of the investigative record. Colby Ryan. Colby is Lori's eldest child and the only one of her 3 children still living. He lost his father Charles, his sister Tylee, and his brother JJ, and in every meaningful sense, his mother. He had once described Lori as a devoted parent who would jump in front of a bullet for her children, and he watched that mother dissolve into someone unrecognizable after she met Chad Daybell. He testified at the trials and delivered victim impact statements that became the emotional summit of the proceedings, telling one court he stood motherless, fatherless, sisterless, and brotherless, and another that his mother herself was the family tragedy. Chapter 22. Where are the kids? A Nation Watches. Few American crime stories of the past decade became as total a media phenomenon as this one, and the reasons are worth examining. Not least because the spectacle, for all the attention it brought, sometimes threatened to swallow the children at its heart. The public case ignited on December 20, 2019, when the Rexburg Police Department announced that JJ and Tylee were missing, that their mother would not cooperate, and that the disappearances might be tied to a suspicious death. The combination was irresistible to a true crime-hungry internet. Missing children, a mother who would not explain, a string of convenient deaths, and soon, the lurid revelation of a doomsday cult. The family's $20,000 reward and the hashtag Where Are the Kids drew thousands of strangers into online groups that traded tips, theories, and timelines. The case crossed from a regional missing persons story into a global event within weeks. National television followed fast. NBC's Dateline, with Keith Morrison, devoted episodes to the mystery while the children were still missing. It was on Dateline that Melanie Gibb offered her gasoline and fire description of the couple. Lori was christened the Doomsday Mom in the press before her children's bodies were ever found, a tabloid handle that fixed her permanently as a type. Local journalism, meanwhile, did the case's most important work. EastIdahoNews.com and its reporter Nate Eaton covered every filing and search, and it was Eaton who flew to Hawaii in January 2020 and captured the surreal footage of Lori and Chad declining on camera to say where the children were, a clip viewed around the world. As the legal process unfolded, the coverage only intensified. The trials were live-streamed. KSL carried Chad Daybell's death penalty trial gavel to gavel, and audiences followed the testimony day by day. In 2022, Netflix released a 3-part documentary series, Sins of Our Mother, built in part around interviews with Colby Ryan and other family members. A project praised for centering the survivors and criticized in some quarters for omissions, including the near-total absence of Lori's late sister Stacy from the family's account. Other true crime programs, from Nancy Grace's Injustice to countless podcasts and specials, returned to the case again and again. By the time of the Arizona trials, Lori Vallow Daybell was among the most recognized accused murderers in the country. There is a discomfort worth naming in all of this. The same machinery that pressured authorities, kept the children's names in a public eye, and ultimately delivered an enormous audience for the verdicts also turned a family's annihilation into content, a serialist entertainment with villains and twists and merchandise-ready nicknames. The armchair sleuths who populated the Facebook groups were, in the main, well-meaning, and some of their attention surely helped. But the families lived the case rather than streamed it, and for them every documentary and headline reopened the wound. Larry Woodcock put the only verdict that matters in plain words after one of the convictions. What did they accomplish? Nothing, he said. What did they do? They destroyed families. That, not the spectacle, is the true measure of the case. Chapter 23, The Chandler Investigation. For nearly 2 years, Charles Vallow's killing was, on paper, a closed matter, a domestic dispute that had ended in what looked like self-defense. How a planned execution came to be written off, and how it was eventually pried back open, is its own chapter in the case, and it turns on the patient, unglamorous work of detectives and the physics of a single bullet. When officers of the Chandler Police Department responded to Alex Cox's 911 call on the morning of July 11, 2019, they walked into a scene that had been arranged to tell a story. Charles Vallow lay dead on the floor of the rental home on South Four Peaks Place. Nearby were an aluminium baseball bat and a baseball cap that had been Charles's. Cox, calm, told them he had shot his brother-in-law in self-defense after Charles attacked him with the bat. Lori and the children, he said, had already left. There was, a detective later testified, surprisingly little blood on its face, with the bat in plain view and the only surviving witnesses telling a consistent tale. It had the shape of a tragedy rather than a crime. No one was arrested. The case was logged, essentially, as a domestic incident. But there were oddities from the first, and the detectives who inherited the file kept pulling at them. The Maricopa County medical examiner ruled Charles's death a homicide. Multiple gunshot wounds, which is routine for any shooting, but the autopsy carried a detail that did not fit the self-defense account. Detective Nathan Duncan, who took over the investigation after the original detective was promoted, would later lay it out for a jury with the bluntness of a man who had stared at the evidence for years. The wounds indicated that one shot had struck Charles while he was standing, and a second had struck him while he was already down on the ground, fired upward into him. The trajectory of an execution, not a struggle. There was a defect in the floor consistent with a bullet strike. If you take those 3 points and then match them up, Duncan testified, then there's no other explanation other than Charles was laying on the ground when one of the shots was fired. A man defending himself does not typically fire a finishing round into a fallen attacker. The timeline was the second thread, and it unraveled the self-defense story completely. Cox claimed he had called 911 within minutes of the shooting. He had not. Investigators determined that roughly 43 to 45 minutes elapsed between the killing and the call, a gap during which no meaningful aid was rendered to a dying man, and during which Cox phoned Lori twice. Years later, a second Chandler detective, Ariel Werther, performed a meticulous analysis of the cell phone location data and testified to its devastating implication. The 911 call came at 8:36 a.m. Lori arrived back at the house at 8:48 a.m. after the police were already there, even though she had told officers she was present when her husband was shot. Werther tracked the movements of the phones that morning. Charles's phone, which Lori had taken with her, traveled with Lori's own phone to a Burger King drive-thru and a Walgreens and was nowhere near the house when 911 was called. The data, Werther testified, led to the inescapable conclusion that either the shooting did not happen that close in time to the 911 call, or that she wasn't there for the shooting. I could not see a third way of interpreting that data. Either reading destroyed the account Lori and Cox had given. If she had been present when Charles was shot, then he had lain dead or dying for the better part of an hour before anyone called for help. The digital record also exposed the motive the staged scene was meant to hide. Investigators recovered an email, sent in late June 2019, in which someone using an account controlled by Lori had impersonated Charles, inviting brother Daybell to Houston to collaborate on a novel, a clumsy attempt to create a pretext for Chad's presence in their lives. Charles found it, and in the days that followed he confronted Lori, Chad, and Tammy about the affair. 11 days before he died, he emailed Tammy directly. Detectives found that Chad was saved in Lori's phone under affectionate aliases, Bubby and Melanie too, and that after Charles's death the messages between Lori and Chad turned, in Duncan's words, into open and obvious romantic exchanges that they had not been before. And they found the text Lori had sent Alex 2 days before the killing, telling him to be like Nephi, the scriptural figure commanded by God to slay a wicked man. Duncan testified that when he researched the reference, the story that always came up was Nephi's justified killing of Laban. There was, too, a warning the system had received and failed to heed. Months before the shooting, on January 31, 2019, Charles had called the Gilbert police and pleaded with officers to help him get Lori an emergency mental health evaluation. In body camera footage later released to the public, he can be heard explaining that his wife believed she was married to an angel, that she met with the angel Moroni and Jesus Christ face to face in the temple every day, that she believed Jesus was returning the following year, and that she thought Charles himself had been taken over by a dark spirit, a being she named, in one of the case's many interchangeable demon names, Nick Schneider. "I want her to get help," Charles told the officers. "She's my wife. I love her to death. Something's gone wrong. I just don't want her to hurt anybody." The officers concluded Lori could take herself to a facility voluntarily. She checked into a behavioral health center and was discharged a few hours later. The man who saw the danger most clearly had asked, on the record, for someone to intervene, and the machinery of help had let him go. It would take the disappearance of 2 children, the exhumation of a wife in Idaho, and a national firestorm before Chandler reopened Charles's death in earnest, and the county finally charged Lori with conspiring to kill him. In October 2021, the department released its entire case file, some 24 gigabytes of body camera footage and more than 1,000 pages of reports, including a 2-hour recorded interview with Tylee Ryan, the only known recording of the girl from that period, conducted weeks before she herself would be killed. The detectives had been right to keep pulling at the threads. Prosecutors later argued that the scene had been staged. The bullet, the timeline, and the phones told the true story, and in 2025 an Arizona jury, hearing all of it, convicted Lori of the conspiracy in under 2 hours. Chapter 24. Counsel and Competency. 2 intertwined legal problems dominated the years between Lori Vallow Daybell's arrest and her first murder trial, and both would later become central to her appeal. The question of whether she was mentally competent to be tried at all, and the disqualification of the lawyer she had chosen to defend her. Because these issues sit at the heart of her bid to overturn her convictions, they are worth examining closely. Death is different. After her extradition to Idaho in early 2020, Lori hired a private attorney named Mark Means. Means was, by most accounts, an unconventional advocate. He embraced the case's media attention, made frequent television appearances, and filed pleadings that struck other lawyers as eccentric, including, at one point, a filing accusing the prosecution of conspiring with the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints against his client. He also represented, for a brief but consequential window in the spring of 2020, roughly April to June, before the children's bodies were found, Chad Daybell. That overlap was the seed of his disqualification. The prosecution had flagged the conflict for months. An earlier judge, Farron Edens, had acknowledged a conflict in the original lesser case, but allowed Lori and Chad to sign a written waiver of it. But those lesser charges were dismissed once the first-degree murder indictment came down in May 2021, and the calculus changed entirely. On December 28, 2021, District Judge Stephen Boyce issued a 17-page ruling disqualifying Means from any involvement in the case. The core of it was the conflict of interest. Under the Idaho Rules of Professional Conduct, an attorney cannot adequately represent 2 clients whose interests may diverge, and Means had represented both defendants in what was now a single, intertwined capital conspiracy. An actual conflict exists, Boyce wrote, and Daybell's waiver is insufficient to overcome the risk of harm. In a capital case, the judge reasoned, the conflict could not simply be waved away by the defendants. Death is different, he wrote, a phrase drawn from American death penalty jurisprudence, and the court's duty to protect the fairness of the proceedings was, in that context, paramount. Boyce gave 2 further reasons that had nothing to do with Chad. First, Means's habit of filing sworn declarations, statements under penalty of perjury containing his own factual assertions about the case, had, the judge found, potentially turned the lawyer into a witness, exactly the situation legal ethics warn against. Second, and more troubling, some of those filings disclosed statements Lori had made to Means while she was housed in a state mental hospital and may not have been competent to waive her attorney-client privilege. This is precisely the situation that ethics rules caution against, Boyce wrote, where the rules stress that lawyers should avoid becoming witnesses in their clients' cases. The judge also noted, pointedly, that Means had no experience handling capital cases. Lori was left with Jim Archibald, a death penalty qualified public defender who had been appointed as co-counsel in August 2021 and who would carry her through trial. Whether all of this was correct is now the work of the Idaho Supreme Court. Lori's appellate brief frames the disqualification as a structural error, a violation of her Sixth Amendment right to counsel of her choosing so fundamental that it taints the entire trial, regardless of whether she can show it changed the outcome. It is the strongest of her appellate claims and the one most worth watching, because the right to choose one's own lawyer is, as her current attorney puts it, a bedrock principle, and because the hearings on Means's removal were conducted partly within Chad's separate case, where Lori's own lawyer could only observe. Fit to stand trial. Running underneath the counsel fight was the competency question. In 2021, after a court-ordered evaluation, Lori was found incompetent to stand trial. Unfit, in the legal sense, to understand the proceedings or to assist in her own defense, and her case was stayed. She was committed to the custody of the Idaho Department of Health and Welfare for treatment aimed at restoring competency, and she remained in a state facility for roughly 10 months. She would later describe that period as a process of competency classes, meetings with doctors, and many evaluators. On April 11, 2022, she was deemed competent, and the prosecution resumed. The proceedings were paused again briefly later that year over the same question before Boyce ultimately found her fit. The competency finding is the root of another appellate claim, that the court made decisions affecting her substantial rights, including, the defense argues, decisions about her representation, during a window when she had been declared unable to participate in her own defense, in violation of her due process rights. The competency issue followed her to Arizona. When she was extradited there to face the conspiracy charges, the trial judge, Justin Boreski, ordered a fresh evaluation. Her appointed attorneys, citing an undisclosed conflict, withdrew, and Lori made a fateful choice. Rather than accept new counsel, she elected to represent herself, to defend her own life against charges carrying life sentences, with no legal training, in 2 separate trials. It is a decision the law permits a competent defendant to make, and one that produced the strange spectacle of a 4-time convicted murderer cross-examining the detectives and relatives who had helped convict her. Whether it was the act of a woman exercising her rights, or one still in the grip of the grandiosity that had defined her for years, a woman who continued to insist she had a divine mission, is a question the trials themselves could not resolve, and the verdicts did not require them to. Chapter 25, The Evidence. The previous chapters have told the case in narrative order. Stripped of the doomsday vocabulary, however, the case against Lori Vallow Daybell and Chad Daybell rests on 3 categories of hard evidence: the bodies, the phones, and the money. Each was meticulously assembled over years, and together they formed a structure that the defense, even a defense built around an absent, conveniently dead co-conspirator, could not pull down. The bodies. The forensic findings from Chad Daybell's backyard were both the emotional and evidentiary core of the case. J.J. Vallow's body, wrapped in plastic with a bag and duct tape around his head, yielded a cause of death the medical examiner could state plainly: asphyxiation. The manner in which he had been buried, deliberately beneath rocks and planks, spoke to concealment by someone with time and intent. Tylee Ryan's remains told a different, and in evidentiary terms, more frustrating story. Her body had been so thoroughly destroyed, burned, dismembered, her hands severed, that the medical examiner could not determine a precise cause of death. That fact is itself a kind of evidence. The mutilation of a teenager's body to the point that science cannot say how she died is not the work of grief or panic, but of someone determined to erase her. DNA recovered from a pickaxe and a shovel in Chad's garage tied those tools to Tylee, and a charm believed to be hers was pulled from the ground. The state did not need a cause of death to prove murder. The condition of the body, the burial, the tools, and the lies told for 9 months did that work. The phones. If the bodies established would have been done, the phones established who had been where and when. Cellular location data placed Alex Cox's device on Chad Daybell's property on September 9, 2019, the day after Tylee was last seen, and the very day Chad texted Tammy his improbable story about shooting and burying a raccoon in the pet cemetery, and again on September 23, around the time JJ vanished. The same kind of analysis that exposed the lies around Charles's death in Arizona was applied to the children's disappearance in Idaho. Phones do not forget, and the devices of the people involved kept placing them at the wrong places at the worst times. The defense fought this evidence where it could. At Chad's trial, a data forensics expert testified that Chad's own device was not shown on the property on the key September dates, an argument the prosecution blunted by noting that Chad was known to use multiple phones, and that the conspiracy did not require him to wield the shovel himself. The geolocation evidence, paired with the text messages, the Be Like Nephi command, the perfectly orchestrated plan to take the children, the references to working on Z's, let prosecutors narrate the conspiracy almost in real time. The money. Finally, there was the financial spine of the case, which prosecutors used to puncture the notion that this was a matter of sincere, if deranged, belief rather than calculated gain. The pattern, as prosecutor Lindsay Blake laid it out, was damning in its precision. Charles Vallow carried a life insurance policy worth roughly $1 million, and within weeks of his death, Lori had contacted the insurer, believing she remained the beneficiary. Charles had changed the beneficiary before he died. She also filed for the children's Social Security survivor benefits, redirecting those benefits into an account in her name alone. Tylee died about 2 weeks after the first of those redirected payments arrived. JJ died within days of the first payments tied to him. And Tammy Daybell died roughly a month after Chad quietly increased her life insurance, which paid him some $430,000. On Alex Cox's side of the ledger, investigators found a roughly $21,000 loan taken out in August 2019 for unspecified medical reasons, though no record of any procedure was ever found, and a buying spree in which Cox acquired dozens of firearms between August and late October. It didn't matter the age of the victim or who relied on them and loved them, Blake told the jury. If they were in the way of Chad and his plan, or if there was money to be gained for Lori and Chad, those individuals were marked for death. The deaths, in other words, were timed to the deposits. The prosecution argued that financial gain formed a significant part of the motive evidence. Chapter 26. After the verdicts. Verdicts end trials. They do not end aftermaths. In the years since the convictions, the physical, legal, and human wreckage of the case has continued to settle, and the people who survived it have had to build lives in its long shadow. The house. For a time, the most haunted address in Idaho remained standing. Chad Daybell's property in Salem. The 4-bedroom house where Tammy was killed, and the 3 3/4 acre lot where the children were buried, passed, through a quitclaim deed, to Chad's defense attorney, John Pryor, in 2021, and Chad's adult children continued to live there for a time. After Chad was sentenced to death, Pryor listed the property for sale. There were unsettling rumors that someone wanted to turn it into a short-term rental. Instead, an anonymous local couple formed a non-profit, SJ Healing Crossroads, and bought the lot for $350,000 specifically to prevent that and to transform it into a place of healing. On September 20th, 2024, volunteer contractors, excavators, dirtworks crews, and haulers who donated roughly 80 man-hours demolished the house and its outbuildings. By late afternoon it was gone, the debris carried to the landfill, and a tree near JJ's burial spot removed. It had a really eerie feeling, one of the contractors said. Another said he never set foot inside and did not want anything to do with it. The non-profit has said it intends to make the land a memorial space. Where 2 children were hidden in the ground, the plan is for something quiet and green. The legal afterlife. The cases themselves continue to move through the courts. Both Lori and Chad have appealed. Lori before the Idaho Supreme Court and in Arizona, Chad through the automatic review that follows an Idaho death sentence, his notice of appeal filed within days of his sentencing. Beyond the criminal appeals, the families of Tammy Daybell and Charles Vallow have pursued civil litigation, the slower, quieter mechanism by which survivors seek a measure of accountability that a prison sentence cannot supply. And the 2019 death of Alex Cox, officially natural, a matter of blood clots, has been re-examined more than once. Some family members have never accepted that the timing was a coincidence, coming as it did the day after he learned Tammy's body would be exhumed and just after he confided that he feared he was the fall guy. No charges have been filed, and the dead cannot be tried, but the question lingers over the case like a held breath. Lori, from prison. Lori Vallow Daybell has not gone quiet. From prison, she has continued to assert her innocence and, by every available account, to inhabit the same grandiose framework that defined her. In a recorded phone call her surviving son Colby posted publicly in October 2024, she claimed to receive higher knowledge directly from Jesus and described herself as being on a divine mission. In a June 2025 interview, days before her final Arizona conviction, she said she still loved Chad, reaffirmed her innocence, and predicted that the 2 of them would one day be exonerated. At her Arizona sentencing, she was fined hundreds of thousands of dollars on each count and made subject to lifetime no-contact orders protecting Brandon Boudreaux, Kay Woodcock, and other relatives of the people she had been convicted of conspiring to kill. Then she was returned to Idaho, to the Pocatello Women's Correctional Center, to serve sentences that will keep her behind bars for the rest of her life. The survivors. The people she left behind have carried the weight differently. Brandon Boudreaux, the one intended victim who lived, testified at trial after trial, standing afterward alongside Kay Woodcock and Colby Ryan, explaining that he had spoken because he owed it to Charles, Tylee, JJ, and Tammy, because I could. Kay and Larry Woodcock, who had set the entire investigation in motion with a grandmother's refusal to be reassured, became outspoken advocates for child safety and for taking seriously the relatives who raise alarms about a child's welfare, a cause born directly from the failure to act on Charles's early warnings. And Colby Ryan, the sole surviving child, has lived the hardest version of the aftermath. Motherless, fatherless, sisterless, brotherless, periodically receiving messages from the woman in prison who took the rest of his family from him, and trying in public and in private to make some meaning out of an annihilation. The case spawned documentaries and a television movie. It became, as the previous chapters described, a true crime industry of its own. But for the handful of people who actually loved Charles, Tammy, Tylee, and JJ, it was never content. It was the end of their world, and the beginning of the rest of their lives without them. Chapter 27. A Family Built on Grievance. Chapter 1 sketched Lori's childhood. This chapter returns to it through the lens of grievance and distrust. To understand the woman, it helps to return to the house she came from, not only the warm, scripture-filled home her mother describes, but the one underneath it, organized around a conviction that the institutions of the wider world were illegitimate and that the truly righteous stood outside their reach. Lori Vallow Daybell did not invent the idea that the rules binding everyone else did not bind her. She was raised inside it. Lori was born on June 26, 1973, the second youngest of the 5 children of Barry Lynn Cox and Janice Lee Cox. Her mother would later describe a happy, boisterous, deeply Latter-day Saint household. It was just a big family, and we did have a lot of fun, Janice said. I raised all our kids in a LDS church, and Lori always loved the scriptures. She took to it right away. Barry, for his part, recalled his daughter weeping as an 8-year-old during one of his lessons. So moved was she, he said, by the sense that her father was a spiritual giant. It is a small, telling anecdote. From childhood, Lori associated holiness with a single overpowering male authority whose word was beyond question. A template she would transfer, decades later, onto Chad Daybell. But the Cox household carried a second, harder current beneath the faith. Barry and Janice identified as sovereign citizens and tax protesters, and they spent the better part of 3 decades at war with the Internal Revenue Service over Barry's insistence that, as he put it, federal income tax is unlawful, and the IRS is a rogue agency. This was not idle grumbling. The record of their litigation is long and almost compulsive. In 1999, Barry was sentenced to a year and a day in prison for making a false statement to the IRS and ordered to pay $232,914 in restitution for the federal income taxes he owed for 1988, 1989, and 1990. In 2004, the federal government sued Barry and Janice for more than $300,000 in back taxes. A court ruled against them in 2008, and the following year Barry filed an administrative claim refusing to pay, naming the United States, the IRS, the Treasury Department, and the Treasury Secretary among the defendants, on the theory that income tax collection was an unauthorized exercise of federal power. That claim was dismissed in 2010. As late as 2021, with their daughter in jail and their grandchildren on the ground, Barry and Janice were still at it, suing the Treasury, representing themselves, demanding the return of roughly $480,000 in all taxes confiscated by the IRS over the past 30 years. A federal judge dismissed that suit too, noting drily that the couple's odyssey began in the late 1990s and that the lawsuit was merely their latest attempt to avoid the payment of federal income taxes. 2 details from this history reach directly into the murders. First, to shield the family's assets from the government he refused to recognize, Barry had at one point placed property in the name of one of his sons. A normalization of the idea that ownership, identity, and the law itself were things to be maneuvered around. Second, in November 2019, the very month his missing grandchildren were becoming a national story, Barry self-published a book titled How the American Public Can Dismantle the IRS, whose prologue raged against an IRS cabal that had imposed an evil regime on Americans and which detoured into familiar far-right conspiracy theories. The Arizona State Bar had already reprimanded him, in 2018, for the unauthorized practice of law after he advertised himself as a legal document writer, drawing a cease and desist order. The household that formed Lori was one in which a charismatic patriarch insisted, against every court that told him otherwise, that he alone understood the true law and that the authorities were a corrupt conspiracy. It is not difficult to see how a daughter raised on that could come to believe that she alone understood a higher law still. When the case broke, the family split along predictable lines. Lori's brother Adam Cox condemned her publicly and became a witness against her. Her sister Summer Shiflett initially defended her, then, after the bodies were found, broke with her in anguish. But Janice held on longest. In a May 2020 interview on CBS, before the children were found, she defended her daughter without reservation. Lori has invested her whole life in those children, she said. So we know there's another whole side to this, we know her. She declared herself positive beyond any doubt that Lori had not harmed the children. She was wrong, in the most terrible way a mother can be wrong about a daughter. Barry and Janice have lived quietly since, in Santan Valley, Arizona, a couple who spent their lives certain that the system was the enemy, and who raised a daughter who took that certainty somewhere they say they never imagined it could go. Chapter 28, The Last Weeks. We have not been able to find any witnesses who have seen JJ since September 24, 2019. Rexburg Police Affidavit. The last chapter of Tylee Ryan's and JJ Vallow's lives unfolded over about 3 weeks in the early autumn of 2019 in a condominium in Rexburg, Idaho, and it can be reconstructed almost day by day from the records investigators later assembled. Read in sequence, it is the quiet, methodical erasure of 2 children, each thread of their ordinary existence snipped, one, by the adults around them. They arrived around September 1st or 2, moving into a condo at 565 Pioneer Road. Alex Cox came too, taking a unit in the same complex. Lori's niece Melanie was nearby as well. For a few days, the children were simply new neighbors. People in the complex saw them. On September 3rd, Lori walked into Kennedy Elementary School and enrolled 7-year-old JJ. The principal, Josh Wilson, remembered it as routine. JJ attended for 3 weeks. A neighbor's home surveillance camera caught him playing outside on September 17th, an ordinary boy on an ordinary afternoon. The last known photograph of him was taken at the condo on September 22nd. The next day, September 23rd, he went to school for the last time. Tylee's thread was cut first, and more quietly. The last confirmed sighting of her is the September 8th trip to Yellowstone, the photographs of a 16-year-old at the park entrance and posing inside, pulled later from Lori's own iCloud account. After that day, investigators could never again place her with certainty. Lori would tell people Tylee was enrolled at Brigham Young University, Idaho. The school had no record of her at any campus. The truth, the family clarified, was that Tylee had finished high school early and was not in school at all. She was simply, after September 8th, gone, and the world would not register her absence for months, because a teenager who's graduated and moved to a new town is exactly the kind of person whose disappearance makes no immediate ripple. JJ's disappearance required more active management, and Lori supplied it. On September 24th, the day after JJ was last seen, she returned to Kennedy Elementary and told administrators she would be homeschooling him. The school, having no reason for alarm, unenrolled him, and, as the principal later noted, withdrawing a child to homeschool is a common process. No other school ever requested JJ's transcripts. That same day, Lori told the family's babysitter that JJ had gone to stay with his grandmother for several weeks and that her services were no longer needed. When a neighbor's child came by the condo in late September to play with JJ, Lori said he had gone to stay with his grandma. Each person who might have noticed his absence was given a separate, plausible, false explanation, tailored to send them away. The most chilling preparations had come even earlier, before the move. JJ was autistic, and he had a service dog, a golden doodle that helped keep him calm. In the days before leaving Arizona, Lori emailed the dog's training company and arranged to have the animal given to another family. Investigators would later find, in a search of her Google history, a query about how to sell service dogs. She had, around the same time, described herself to others as an empty nester, a woman with no children at home, while her 2 children were, by every indication, still alive. After the children were gone, the household machinery kept running with grotesque normalcy. On October 1st, Lori rented a storage unit and, that same day, bought a wedding ring online. Among the items investigators eventually recovered from her possession were the children's birth certificates, JJ's iPad, his Kennedy Elementary registration receipts, his prescription for the medication that managed his autism, and Tylee's bank card, and used since early September, and Tylee's own cell phone. The second bedroom of the condo, where 2 children should have been living, showed no sign of having been occupied at all. By the time the world began asking where the children were, every ordinary trace of them had already been quietly severed. The school, the dog, the babysitter, the neighbors, the phone, the bank card. Tylee and JJ had not run away and had not been sent anywhere. They had been killed within days of the September sightings and buried in Chad Daybell's yard, while the adults responsible filed them, one explanation at a time, under the heading of people who were simply no longer around. Chapter 29. The Death of Tammy Daybell. This chapter returns to Tammy Daybell's death in detail because, of the 4 deaths, hers was the one most nearly perfect as a crime. The one that almost escaped notice entirely, and that, but for an exhumation, might have stood forever as a sad natural death in the night. Her case is a study in how homicide can be disguised as a tragedy, and how thin the line is between the two when no one is looking closely. Tamara Tammy Douglas Daybell was born in 1970, married Chad in 1990, raised 5 children, and worked as a school librarian. She was, by every account, healthy, with no known medical conditions, an active 49-year-old woman. That ordinariness is what makes the autumn of 2019 so sinister in retrospect, because the violence came for her in 2 distinct waves. The first wave failed. On October 9, 2019, Tammy called 911 to report that a masked man had approached her outside her home and fired at her with what she believed was a paintball gun. She was unhurt and baffled. She posted about the strange episode on Facebook, saying she had no idea who would target her or why. Investigators later assembled a darker reading of that night. Alex Cox's phone had pinged near the Daybell residence roughly 4 hours earlier. At Cox's home, investigators would find an AR-15 rifle, along with internet searches about how particular type of round would penetrate a Dodge Dakota, the make of pickup the Daybells owned. The prevailing conclusion was that the paintball gun had in fact been a real firearm that malfunctioned, and that the masked man had an Alex Cox, sent to kill Tammy and foiled by a jam. The same night, prosecutors said, Lori and her niece Melanie had been performing a casting ritual against Tammy. The bullet and the prayer were aimed at the same target. 10 days later, the second wave succeeded. On October 19, 2019, the Daybell family called 911 to report that Tammy had died in her sleep. Her son Garth, in the house, later described hearing a thump and then his father shouting for help in a panic unlike anything he had heard. Sheriff's deputies came to the home. Chad told them Tammy had been ill, that she had been coughing and unwell, and that she had simply not woken. It was his right, under Idaho practice, to decline an autopsy, and he exercised it. The coroner accepted his account and the apparent absence of foul play, and the death was recorded as natural, the presumed result, in effect, of a sudden cardiac event. Tammy was embalmed and buried on October 22 at Evergreen Cemetery in Springville, Utah, with a memorial service in Rexburg the following day. The crime was, at that moment, complete and invisible. Within the month, Chad collected roughly $430,000 in life insurance, coverage he had quietly increased shortly before her death, and married Lori Vallow on a beach in Hawaii. What reopened it was the children's disappearance, and a sister's knowledge. As investigators bore down on Lori and Chad over the missing children in late 2019, the suspicious circumstances of Tammy's sudden death, the failed shooting 10 days prior, the hasty remarriage, the life insurance, drew their attention. Tammy's own sister, Samantha Gwilliam, gave police a crucial detail. She told them about the pet cemetery on the Daybell property, the spot that would later yield the children's remains. On December 11, 2019, authorities exhumed Tammy's body from the Springville Cemetery and conducted the autopsy that should have been done the first time. The findings, completed by early 2021 and revealed to the public during Lori's 2023 trial, were unambiguous. Tammy had not died of natural causes. She had been asphyxiated, suffocated, and bruising on her body, sustained around the time of death, was consistent with her having been restrained. The text messages investigators recovered supplied the doctrine that had framed it. Chad and Lori had discussed Tammy as being in limbo, possessed by a spirit they called Viola, and ultimately as a zombie. Roughly a day after he reported finding his wife dead, Chad had messaged Lori 4 words that, in context, are among the coldest in the entire case. I know exactly how you feel. Chapter 30. 6 weeks in Boise. The earlier trial chapter records Lori Vallow Daybell's verdict and sentence. This one follows the trial itself in fuller sequence. Her murder trial ran for roughly 6 weeks in the spring of 2023 in the Ada County Courthouse in Boise, where the case had been moved to find an untainted jury. Cameras were barred from the courtroom, so the public followed along through courtroom sketches, reporters' live updates, and the audio recordings the court released. What that record shows is a methodical prosecution that built its case in layers: belief, then money, then movement, then family, until the structure was complete. This is how the weeks unfolded. Openings and the believers. After about a week of jury selection, testimony began on April 10. The prosecution's early witnesses established the world Lori had entered. On April 13, her former close friend and podcast partner Melanie Gibb took the stand and traced the arc of Lori's beliefs and her drift towards Chad Daybell. The next day, April 14, Zulema Pastines, the widow of Alex Cox, described the group's doctrine in unsettling detail. The grading of human beings as light or dark, the castings, the conviction that Alex was a reincarnated warrior of God. The proceedings had been briefly shortened on April 12 after a death in the family of one of the lead prosecutors. 3 Idaho law enforcement witnesses testified that day. Through these witnesses, the jury learned the vocabulary, zombies, light and dark, death percentages, that made the rest of the evidence legible. The money and the machines. The middle of the trial belonged to the documents and the data, and it was, by the reporters' accounts, technical enough that jurors sometimes looked tired, but it was devastating. Rexburg Police Detective David Stubbs walked through the searches of the apartments connected to Lori, one of which bore her name though she did not live in it, and another where she actually lived but which was listed under Alex Cox's name. An FBI analyst, Nicole Heidemann, presented the defendants' Google search histories, and they read like a confession written in a search bar. From Chad's account, wedding jewelry, a query about when you surprise someone with accusations, and searches checking whether his astrological sign was compatible with Lori's, and with his still-living wife's. From Lori's, life insurance plans for children, how to sell a service dog, and wedding items. Heidemann also laid out one of the trial's most quietly damning sequences, the wedding rings. Lori had searched for malachite, the green stone she wanted for her wedding band, in May 2019, months before she was a widow or Chad a widower. She ordered rings. She adjusted the sizes, and the timeline of those size changes tracked, with awful precision, against the death of Tammy Daybell. The jury also met the burner phones, saved in various contacts under aliases. Bubby, Raphael, James and Elena, Bishop Miller, the secret architecture of a relationship conducted in the shadows of 2 marriages. Then came the cellular evidence. FBI Special Agent Nick Balance, of the Bureau's Cellular Analysis Survey Team, mapped the towers around Lori's apartment and Chad's property and tracked the movements of the phones belonging to Lori, Chad, and Alex Cox. He testified to the contacts among the 3 of them on the days that mattered, around the failed shooting of Tammy on October 9th, on October 18th, the day before Tammy died, and through the night of her death, when Cox's device tracked near the Daybell home and calls passed between Alex and Chad. Balance was careful about the limits of the science. A phone selects the strongest tower, not always the nearest. One cannot pinpoint an exact location, and the defense pressed those limits on cross-examination. But the pattern was unmistakable. The phones placed the conspirators together again and again, at exactly the wrong moments. The recovery and the family. Toward the end, the prosecution turned from data back to flesh and blood. A retired Rexburg detective, Rick Schmidt, testified about the surveillance footage from Lori's storage unit and about shooting ranges where Cox had signed in, and about remains found near a fire pit. FBI Special Agent Steve Daniels, of the Evidence Response Team, described the strategy behind the June 9, 2020 search of Chad's property and the careful, terrible work of recovering the children's bodies. The state medical examiner presented the autopsy findings, JJ's death by asphyxiation, the impossibility, given the condition of Tylee's remains, of determining how she had died. Forensic analysis tied Alex Cox to the plastic that had been wrapped around JJ, and Tylee's DNA to the pickaxe and shovel from Chad's garage. And then on April 18th, came Colby Ryan, Lori's only surviving child, who testified to the human reality beneath all the data. How his mother had cut off contact after the move, how the texts he received from his sister Tylee's phone had not sounded like her. A week later, on April 25th, the trial reached its emotional peak with the testimony of Summer Shiflett, Lori's sister. Summer told the jury she had not known the children were missing until December 2019, that as late as February 2020 Lori had assured her the children were safe, and that she had believed her. Then the prosecution played the recorded jailhouse call from after the bodies were found, in which Summer confronted her sister with the sentence that became the trial's epitaph. "You threw them away like garbage." Summer also confirmed 2 things the defense could not undo: that their brother Alex had been left, by a teenage car accident, with the judgment of an adolescent, and that Lori had become a different person after she met Chad Daybell. Verdict. When the state rested, the defense did something that startled observers. It rested too, almost immediately. Lori called no witnesses and did not testify. There was, in the end, very little that could be said against the accumulation. The jury saw the Hawaii wedding photographs, Chad playing a ukulele while Lori danced, the two of them kissing on the beach in their malachite rings, set against the evidence of the children buried in his yard. On May 12, 2023, after roughly 6 weeks, the jury convicted Lori Vallow Daybell on every count. An alternate juror, asked afterward what had crystallized it, described the effect of seeing those beach wedding images beside the photographs of the murdered children, and reached for a single word for the woman in the courtroom: a monster. Chapter 31. The cracks in the system. It is tempting to treat this case as a freak event, a collision of one extraordinarily manipulative woman, one credulous doomsday author, and one suggestible brother, a perfect and unrepeatable storm. But the more useful and more uncomfortable reading is that the murder succeeded, for as long as they did, because they slipped through gaps that exist in ordinary systems everywhere. Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow were killed in September 2019. Their deaths were not even investigated until December, and their bodies were not found until June 2020. That 9-month silence was not only the work of liars. It was also the work of institutions that, at several points, had information and did not act on it. The earliest and most painful failure belonged to the months before any child died. In late January and February 2019, Charles Vallow told police, in person and on the record, that his wife believed she was a god, that she met with an angel and Jesus face to face, that she thought he had been taken over by a dark spirit, and that she had threatened to kill him. He begged officers to help him get her an emergency mental health evaluation. The system's response was to conclude that Lori could take herself to a facility voluntarily. She went, and was discharged within hours, and the warning evaporated. Charles also filed for divorce and obtained an order of protection. Every formal mechanism a frightened man could reach for, he reached for. None of them was built to register the specific danger he was describing, not domestic violence in the familiar sense, but a spouse who had come to believe, sincerely, that he was no longer human. 5 months later he was dead, and the warnings he had carefully created sat unread in the files until after the children were gone too. A second gap opened in the autumn, around the children themselves. When Lori withdrew JJ from Kennedy Elementary on September 24 to homeschool him, the school did exactly what schools routinely do. It processed the withdrawal. As the principal later explained, unenrolling a child to homeschool is a common, unremarkable request, and there was nothing at the time to raise alarm. In most American states, a parent's declaration of intent to homeschool effectively removes a child from the one institution, the school, best positioned to notice when a child stops appearing in the world. JJ vanished into that blind spot, and Tylee, having finished school early, had never been inside it at all. No truancy officer, no mandated reporter, no system of any kind was watching for 2 children whose mother had simply announced they would henceforth be educated at home and visiting relatives. The machinery that protects children assumes that someone, somewhere, will keep seeing them. For 9 months, the only people insisting on seeing JJ were a grandmother and grandfather 1,000 miles away. That is the third and decisive piece. The case was broken not by a system, but by a family member who refused to be managed. Kay and Larry Woodcock made the calls, demanded the welfare check, offered the reward, and would not accept the shifting stories. It is a damning thing to say of any child protection apparatus that its most effective component, in the end, was a determined grandmother in Louisiana. Out of that recognition, the Woodcocks turned their grief into advocacy, campaigning for authorities to take seriously the relatives who raise alarms about a child's welfare, precisely the alarms that have been discounted in their own case and in Charles Vallow's. There is, finally, the question the case forced upon the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints and the communities around it. Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow were not products of mainstream Latter-day Saint doctrine. The Church has been emphatic, and accurately so, that their beliefs in reincarnation, energy healing, casting out zombies, and personal apocalyptic revelation were far outside its teachings, and that the platforms they used, preparing a people, the AVOW Forum, were never church-affiliated. One of those platforms, AVOW, had even appeared in a watchdog organization's 2019 survey of anti-government extremist groups. And yet the case obligated many within the faith to reckon with how readily its language, prophecy, visions, preparation for the second coming, the gathering of a chosen remnant, could be borrowed by charismatic figures operating in the unregulated marketplace of prophecy at the religion's fringe, and bent towards something murderous. The lesson is not unique to one church. It is that apocalyptic certainty, married to the conviction that ordinary rules do not bind the chosen, is a combination that has produced horror across many traditions, and that the people most vulnerable to it are often, like Lori, those who were taught young that they were special, and that the world's authorities were not to be believed. These closer looks do not exhaust the record. No single book could, but they reach the load-bearing facts, where Lori came from, how the children were made to disappear, how Tammy's murder nearly passed for grief, how the case was finally proven in a Boise courtroom, and how the institutions that might have intervened did not. What remains is to remember, one last time, the people for whom all of it was not a story, but the end of their lives. Epilogue. The ones who are lost. It is easy, with a case this strange, to let the zombies and death percentages and past lives on other planets crowd out the human beings at its heart. They deserve the last word. Charles Vallow was a generous man who, by his sons' and brothers' accounts, made sure the people around him had a good life. He saw the danger early, wrote it down in court filings, obtained an order of protection, and begged the system to take his wife's mental state seriously. He was killed for it on a July morning, while picking up the little boy he had adopted and loved. Left bleeding on the floor while his killer waited 3/4 of an hour to call for help. Tammy Daybell was a school librarian and a mother of 5, married to Chad for nearly 30 years, the steady center of her family. She called for help when someone shot at her in her own driveway, and 10 days later, she was suffocated in her bed so that her husband could marry another woman and collect on a life insurance policy he had quietly increased the month before. Tylee Ryan was 16, weeks from 17, a girl who loved her little brother so completely that she treated him as her own child. The last photograph of her shows her standing in the September light at the edge of Yellowstone, smiling, with no idea that the adults who brought her there had already decided she would not be coming home. What was done to her body afterward is among the cruelest details in the modern annals of American crime. Joshua J.J. Vallow was 7, autistic, exuberant, adored by the grandparents who raised him through his first hard year and never stopped fighting for him. He was killed with a plastic bag and duct tape and buried beneath rocks in a backyard by the mother who had promised, in adopting him, to keep him safe, and whose only condition of adoption had been that the people who truly loved him, the Woodcocks, be allowed to remain in his life. They kept their promise to him. She did not keep hers. Brandon Boudreaux survived. He lived for years in fear, went into hiding with his own children, and stood at last in an Arizona courtroom to say that no one deserves a life of fear and trauma. That he is alive to say it is the single thread of mercy in the entire account, the one bullet that missed. And then there is Colby Ryan, Lori's eldest child, the one who lived. He lost his father, his sister, his little brother, and in every way that matters, his mother. He was turned against his father by a lie, and carries the grief of that estrangement still. Starting 6 years ago, he told an Arizona court, the horror began. He named, more precisely than any prosecutor could, what his mother had become. I believe that Lori Vallow herself is the family tragedy. Lori Vallow Daybell is now in her early 50s. She is serving multiple consecutive life sentences in Idaho, with 2 more consecutive life sentences from Arizona stacked behind them, and appeals pending that have not, to date, disturbed any of her convictions. She has never acknowledged guilt. She speaks, when she speaks, of being misunderstood, of family tragedy, of pain she did not cause. Juries who heard the evidence accepted the prosecution's account beyond a reasonable doubt. The beliefs were bizarre. The harm was real. And 5 people, a husband, a wife, a sister's rival, and 2 children who trusted the adults around them, paid for a story Lori Vallow Daybell told herself about who she was and what she was allowed to do. Appendix, a timeline of key events. Dates are drawn from court records and contemporaneous reporting. Where sources differed slightly, the better corroborated date is used. Before the killings. August 11th, 1968, Chad Guy Daybell is born in Provo, Utah. June 26th, 1973, Lori Noreen Cox is born in Southern California. March 9th, 1990, Chad Daybell marries Tamara Tammy Douglas. 1992, Lori, age 19, marries her first husband, Nelson Yanes. The marriage soon ends. October 1995, Lori marries William LaGioia. Their son Colby is born in 1996. They divorce in 1998. 2001, Lori marries Joseph Ryan. Daughter Tylee is born September 24, 2002. They divorce in 2005. February 24, 2006, Lori marries Charles Vallow in Las Vegas. 2007, Lori's brother Alex Cox attacks Joseph Ryan with a stun gun. He serves 90 days. May 25, 2012, Joshua J.J. Vallow is born. Charles and Lori adopt him in 2013. June 2015, Chad and Tammy Daybell moved to Salem, near Rexburg, Idaho. Around this time, Lori discovers Chad's books. 2018, Joseph Ryan dies of cardiovascular disease. October 2018, Lori meets Chad in person at a Preparing a People event. The affair begins. February 2019, Charles Vallow files for divorce and obtains an order of protection, citing Lori's beliefs and threats. The Killings and the Search. 2019 to 2020. July 11, 2019, Alex Cox shoots and kills Charles Vallow at Lori's home in Chandler, Arizona. September 8, 2019, Tylee Ryan is last seen alive on a Yellowstone trip with Lori, JJ, and Alex Cox. September 9, 2019, Alex Cox's phone is placed at Chad's property. Chad texts Tammy about burying a raccoon. September 23, 2019, JJ Vallow is last seen alive in Rexburg. October 2, 2019, Brandon Boudreaux is shot at from Tylee's Jeep in Gilbert, Arizona, and survives. October 9, 2019, someone shoots at Tammy Daybell outside her home. She is unhurt. October 19, 2019, Tammy Daybell is found dead. Her death is initially ruled natural. November 5, 2019, Chad Daybell marries Lori Vallow in Hawaii, about 2 weeks after Tammy's death. November 26, 2019, a welfare check requested by the Woodcocks finds the children missing. Lori and Chad mislead police. November 27, 2019, Lori and Chad vacate their home. Police execute search warrants. Early December 2019, Lori and Chad fly to Kauai, Hawaii. December 11, 2019, Tammy Daybell's body is exhumed. The autopsy finds asphyxiation. December 12, 2019, Alex Cox dies of natural causes. December 20, 2019, Rexburg police announce the children are missing. A $20,000 reward is offered. January 2020, investigators confront the couple in Hawaii. Lori misses a January 30th deadline to produce the children. February 20, 2020, Lori is arrested in Princeville, Kauai on a $5 million warrant. March 5, 2020, Lori is extradited to Idaho. June 9, 2020, the children's remains are found on Chad's property. Chad is arrested. June 13, 2020, the remains are officially identified as JJ Vallow and Tylee Ryan. The prosecutions, 2021 to 2026. May 24 to 25, 2021, a grand jury indicts Lori and Chad for the first-degree murders of Tylee, JJ, and Tammy. May 27, 2021, Lori is found incompetent to stand trial. Her case is stayed. April 11, 2022, Lori is restored to competency after treatment. March 2, 2023, the two cases are severed for separate trials. March 21, 2023, the death penalty is withdrawn against Lori as a sanction for a discovery violation. May 12, 2023, an Idaho jury convicts Lori on all counts. July 31, 2023, Lori is sentenced to life without parole. May 30, 2024, an Idaho jury convicts Chad Daybell on all counts. June 1, 2024, Chad is sentenced to death. April 22, 2025, an Arizona jury convicts Lori of conspiring to murder Charles Vallow. June 12, 2025, an Arizona jury convicts Lori of conspiring to murder Brandon Boudreaux. July 25, 2025, Lori is sentenced to 2 more consecutive life terms in Arizona. 2025 to 2026, Lori's appeals proceed before the Idaho Supreme Court, and in Arizona, Chad's capital appeal is pending. A note on sources. This account is built entirely from publicly available material. Its backbone is the documented record of the prosecutions themselves, the Idaho indictments and charging affidavits in the Madison and Fremont County cases, the proceedings in State v. Vallow Daybell and State v. Daybell in Ada County, Idaho, and the 2 Maricopa County, Arizona prosecutions for the death of Charles Vallow and the attempted murder of Brandon Boudreaux. Within that record, the book draws on sworn trial testimony and closing arguments reported from open court, probable cause and search warrant filings from the Chandler and Rexburg police departments, coroner and medical examiner findings introduced at trial, including the exhumation autopsy of Tammy Daybell and the autopsies of Tylee Ryan and JJ Vallow, and the documents filed in the ongoing appeals, including the appellant's opening brief and the state's response before the Idaho Supreme Court. It also relies on the contemporaneous reporting of national and regional newsrooms that covered the case closely from 2019 onwards, among them the Associated Press, CNN, CBS News, NBC News, ABC News, NPR, PBS, KSL, the Deseret News, Court TV, Inside Edition, and, indispensably, given its on-the-ground proximity, EastIdahoNews.com, whose journalists, including Nate Eaton, documented the investigation, the Hawaii confrontation, and the discovery of the remains. NBC's Dateline and Netflix's three-part documentary Sins of Our Mother provided additional first-person accounts from family members, and the work of religious studies scholars such as Christopher James Blythe, along with Leah Sotilli's book-length reporting, informed the background on the prophecy subculture and the families. Where accounts differed on a date or a detail, the more authoritative or better corroborated version was used, and the uncertainty acknowledged in the text. Direct quotations are reproduced from reporting on the proceedings and from recorded statements entered into evidence. Nothing has been invented or embellished. Because appellate proceedings in both states were ongoing at the time of writing in 2026, readers seeking the current status of any appeal should consult the dockets of the Idaho Supreme Court and the Arizona Appellate Courts for the most up-to-date information. Finally, a word about restraint. This is a case that invites sensationalism, the cult language, the beauty pageant past, the beach wedding over fresh graves. Wherever possible, this book has tried to let the documented facts carry their own weight, and to keep the two murdered children, rather than the bizarre theology that was used to justify their deaths, at the moral center of the story. If it has succeeded even partly in that, it is because Tylee Ryan and J.J. Vallow deserved at least that much, and received so much less.